From Best Friend to Husband, a Pumpkins and Proposals novel. The Harvest Ranch romance series. Written by Lucy McConnell. Narrated by Liz Crane. Chapter 1. Wynn. I've got my mind set on you, Wynn Westbrook crooned as she swiped the paint roller over the top of the outdoor table. The watertight glaze went on milky white, covering the distressed teal-blue paint she'd worked so hard on yesterday. But it's gonna take time, a lot of precious time, she continued to sing along with George Harrison, his lyrics pumping through her earbuds. She scooted back, pumping her arms and bobbing her knees along to the music. The farm table was done, and she was ecstatic. It was the crowning piece for her booth at the Harvest Festival, and she'd earn enough on this bad boy to buy groceries for 3 months. Set on you, she sang as she spun in a tight circle, tossing her arms over her head and then bringing them back down with a full-body shimmy. The world spun past her, and her brain registered that there was someone else in her garage. She yelped, ripping her earbuds out. "Judd!" she scolded her ex-brother-in-law. Judd quirked his lips in his signature bad boy grin. "You forgot this move." He hustled into the running man, his tongue poking out of the side of his mouth in concentration. "I was getting there, but I had to get through the Roger Rabbit first." She kicked her leg back, pushed out her chest, and busted a move. He lifted his arm, starting the snake, ending with his hand pointing at her. She took it, moved her arms in a wave, and then rolled it back through her body, dissolving into giggles. "What are you doing here?" She shoved his arm. "I heard about a rave in your garage, so I rushed right over." His sandy blonde hair was a little shaggy, and he had a 3-day growth on his chin. She'd bet $20 he would shave that night. He thought his blonde facial hair was unmanly, especially compared to his brothers, who all grew beards in shades from medium to dark brown. She heartily disagreed with him, but not out loud. There were rules to follow. "No, really, I saw something that reminded me of you." "Oh?" She perked up, wondering what he'd seen. "I had to throw it in my truck and bring it right over." He didn't smile, which was strange for him. Whenever he'd had a surprise for her in the past, he could barely contain himself. Stifled giggles reached her ears, and she suddenly understood the game he played. I'm so curious. What could it be?" She tapped her chin, feigning confusion. "Don't tell me. I want to guess." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "Was it something I can refurbish?" She set the roller down and grabbed a rag to wipe off her fingers. "Nope, it's already beautiful." Her little man, hiding behind the corner, cleared his throat. "And handsome." Judd looked over his shoulder. "Strong, too, like huge muscles." Wynn stifled her snort. At 7, Miles thought he was the toughest kid in his class. "Well, now I'm totally out of ideas." "Surprise!" Judd threw up his hands. Her kids ran into the garage, sporting chocolate-smeared grins on their faces. Wynn bent down and opened her arms to give both a welcome-home hug. "No way! You two are supposed to be on the bus." She glanced at the clock on the wall. She'd planned on 20 more minutes of mom time to shower and do something respectable with her hair. "You surprised me." "Uncle Judd picked us up after school," Miles informed her with all seriousness. "And then he took us to Choco Lattes for oopsies." Lainey, who was 5 and had yet to create a filter between her brain and her mouth, as well as the ability to hide anything, grinned. One of her ponytails drooped, and Wynn reached to fix it. "Oh, he did he?" "Don't be mad." Judd gave her that bad boy grin again. "I brought you some. They're on the kitchen counter." "I'll get them." Lainey ran back inside and appeared a moment later with a white bag. She handed it to Judd. "You knew Presley was dipping today, didn't you?" Wynn stared at the bag, unable to take her eyes off of it for fear it would disappear. Harvest Ranch was a small town with a lot of big personalities and extended families. Wynn had married into one of them right after high school, built a house on the family plot, and buried her husband a few years later. Her husband's family, the Westbrooks, kept her and the kids close, which was just fine by her. Her own family was a mess. Her parents divorced a few years back and Mom moved away. Dad, well, she didn't want to think about him. When Grandpa Westbrook had died, Grandma divided up the farmland among her children. The lots on this side of the street were owned by Judd and his siblings. So far, there were 3 houses, and room for more. On the other side of the street was a string of cousins and Grandma Karen's original house. There was more space on the outside of town, where the oldest son raised cattle, trained horses, and rodeoed. Grandma Karen had built an industrial kitchen off the back of her home and started the chocolate shop on Main Street. Her daughter, Michelle, added in a coffee bar and changed the name to Choco Latte when she took over. It was no surprise that Presley, Michelle's daughter, followed in her mother's and grandmother's footsteps and became the best chocolatier in the state. She hand-dipped twice a week, making the street smell like heaven and tormenting every sweet tooth within 3 miles. Wynn happened to have 2 of them. Judd wiggled the bag, making it crinkle. Presley said you'd want mint, but I told her you've been leaning toward the milk chocolate orange truffles. Wynn dropped her head back and let out a groan. Okay, you're forgiven for sneaking my children off to the candy store. Not that he was ever in trouble. Ever since Thatcher passed away, Judd had been the kids' emergency contact, babysitter, and go-to for all things male. Wynn didn't know what she'd do without him. He grinned triumphantly and held out the bag. She went to take it, her mouth watering. Seeing the paint and stain glistening on her skin, she made a face. Hang on. Judd opened the bag. I got you. He held out a truffle for her to bite. She opened her mouth and closed it over the whole treat, her teeth scraping against the side of his finger as she pulled back. Her stomach swooped, and her heart stumbled over a beat. She locked eyes with Judd, and her breath caught. What was that? Chapter 2. Judd. Judd's mouth went dry and fell slightly open. His fingers tingled where Wynn's lips had made contact. He tried, but failed to swallow. He needed to pull himself together. This was Wynn. No matter how hard he'd tried over the years, he'd never been able to think of her as a sister. And man, had he tried. But unlike his baby sister, Birdie, Wynn was just a year younger than him, and she was his best friend. It was strange, growing up with the knowledge that his brother was going to die before he was 30. No one expected him to get married, father kids, or even build a house on his family plot. But he did all those things, thanks to Wynn. Wynn and Thatcher fell in love in high school. She came from a dysfunctional family and was aching to love and be loved. Thatcher's family was full of love, but short on time. Wynn didn't care if they had 5 minutes or 50 years together. She'd found a safe harbor for her heart and parked her ship there. She was a hero to Judd and his family, giving Thatcher the chance to pack so much more life into his allotted years. At first, Judd had been jealous of Wynn. He and Thatcher were close in age and joined in the hip since Mom and Dad brought Thatcher home from the hospital. Having a girl in the mix disjointed their relationship and knocked him off his spot. Or so he'd thought. It hadn't taken long for Wynn to win him over. She was the one who'd insisted Judd join them on dates to watch a movie or get hopelessly lost in the corn maze at the Harvest Festival. They'd become 3 of a kind, a trio of best friends. Wynn had helped him navigate his first heartbreak, and he'd helped Thatcher build the swing set in the backyard when they'd been expecting Miles. Through all of that, Judd had looked at Wynn as Thatcher's woman. Not once had he seen her as a single, available gal. Not while they turned her garage into a workroom for her advanced crafting projects. Not while he cooked dinner for the kids so she could take a shower and relax for a few minutes. And certainly not when they'd all pile on the couch to watch the latest Disney movie and stuff their faces with popcorn on Saturday nights. Those thoughts had stayed locked behind an iron door. Until her mouth brushed his fingers. All she'd done was graze her teeth against his skin, and the hinges on the forbidden door sprang open. He tried to shake himself free of the knowledge that she was more than his buddy, his pal. But that was like trying to shake off steel grip pliers. He dropped the bag of Oopsie's chocolates on the work table. "I'll get the kids going on homework so you can clean up." "Do you have to go back to work today?" Judd owned an electrical company. He had several trucks and guys out on jobs, but had already made the rounds checking in and putting out fires. "Nope, I'm good." "Do you mind sticking around tonight, too? I have the pre-festival meeting." "Right." He snapped his fingers. "Sure." "It's not a problem?" she pressed, her forehead creased with concern. His hand twitched to wipe the lines away, but he managed to keep it at his side. Wynn wasn't, nor would she ever be, his. They were friends, best friends, and he wasn't going to mess that up by doing something stupid like caressing her cheek. "I'm happy to be here." He was. This house felt much more like a home than his did. His was quiet. So quiet he could hear the fridge hum. "I'll start dinner." He ducked inside, shooing the kids ahead of him while he gathered himself. He pulled ground turkey from the fridge and a frying pan from the hook on the wall. His eyes stung as he chopped an onion. It felt good. Normal. By the time the kids followed their noses in for dinner, he was back to himself. Chapter 3. Wynn. The big barn was packed with business owners, booth operators, food vendors, city council members, and citizens of Harvest Ranch who liked to be in the know concerning the annual festival. A month-long event, the festival drew people from all across the country to their sleepy neck of the woods to enjoy traditional Swiss food, dances, and music. Early Swiss residents had brought their architecture and cobblestone streets with them, making Harvest Ranch a place removed from regular life. Tourists flocked here all year round, but October was the biggest month for tourism. And that was saying something, considering they had a ski resort. Wynn waved at her in-laws on the front row. They owned a B&B that was popular and profitable. The whole family helped run it. Well, almost all of them. Their oldest son, Brody, had left the business, and the family, in a huff a couple of years before Wynn married Thatcher. He went to college and moved back home 6 months before Thatcher died, building a house on the other side of her from Judd. She was always grateful the brothers had gotten a chance to say goodbye. Brody was a great guy, a good uncle who pitched in when it didn't involve seeing the other members of the family. The rift between them was wide, and she didn't know if it would be healed in this lifetime. Wynn cleaned rooms. She didn't love the work, but she didn't mind it either. Anders, Thatcher's younger brother, was the handyman. He was building a wood shop behind the B&B to work on special orders. If he wasn't careful, he'd have a new business to run. He was that good at woodworking. Wynn found a seat in the middle of the room, scooting into the row to make sure seats were available for latecomers. She'd been late enough to know the relief of an open end seat. Mirabelle Mason had a small group of people gathered around her phone. She threw out words like influencer and next level that rose above the din. Wynn shook her head. She wasn't looking to go big time or be the next great Pinterest star. She just wanted to sell her crafts and projects. Maybe she was a small dreamer, but that was okay. Not everyone had to be famous. "Wynn Westbrook? Is that you?" Wynn flipped in her seat to find her long-lost junior high BFF, Dorothy, grinning at her. Wynn squealed and jumped to her feet, spinning to hug Dorothy, who was also bouncing up and down with glee. "What are you doing here? I thought you were going to design school," Wynn said as they sat back down. Wynn twisting in her chair so they could talk. I did." Dorothy flipped her gorgeous light brown hair over her shoulder. She wore a pair of dark-wash skinny jeans and an emerald-colored flowing shirt. "I was at a design house in Georgia, but Harvest Ranch called me home." Something shifted in Dorothy's eyes, making Wynn wonder what or who had placed that call. She racked her brain for any news about Dorothy's family that could bring her back to the small town, but couldn't remember hearing anything. "Well, I'm glad you're here. What are you doing in the festival?" Dorothy brightened. "I'm in charge of the pumpkin displays and decorations." Wynn's mouth fell open. "That's a huge job!" And one with a lot of pressure. Harvest Ranch's displays were photographed and videoed by magazines and websites the world over. Dorothy laughed and flapped her hand. "I've been doing this in my head since I was 10. Remember that time I made them rearrange the entrance display?" "Oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that." Wynn smoothed her features into a teasing, serious look. "Mrs. Tinder was not happy when she saw it. But she didn't make them change it back, because my design was better." "So true." Mayor Helen James waved from the stage. "Can you all hear me in the back?" An answering yes echoed. "Don't leave. I want to get your number," Wynn told Dorothy before spinning in her seat and opening her day planner to the section she'd set apart for festival information. Judd was constantly teasing her about carrying around a dinosaur. Yes, the pen and paper were old-fashioned, but a book didn't have a battery that could die, and it was pretty much attached to her hand, so she rarely had to go looking for it. Unlike her cell phone, which she lost on a daily basis. She checked her back pocket to make sure it was still there. "We're so thrilled to have you all be a part of the festival this year." A shot of happiness went over Wynn as she clapped in agreement along with the other attendees. She was finally doing it! Finally going to have a booth full of her farm-style furniture and decor on display. 6 months of splinters and paint stains would pay off. This wasn't about the money, though she was thrilled with that as well. It was about stepping out into the world on her own. She wanted to prove to herself that she was capable of having an idea and seeing it through. She and Thatcher had grown up fast after graduation, but in many ways, they'd still been kids. Adulting meant putting herself out there, and she hadn't done that. Yet. Well, she was doing it now. The mayor continued. "We'll start with the latest info from the health department for the food vendors, and we'll move on to the updated credit card system." Wynn nodded as she turned on her phone and updated the credit card app. The festival had managed to arrange a system that they could all use to take credit card payments while ensuring the money went into the right account and the charges came out. She'd attended an orientation on it a month ago and was relieved that it wasn't too difficult to master. Her phone buzzed, and she pulled it out of her pocket to find a picture of Judd and the kids out at his cousin's ranch. His uncle had a nice spread out there where they raised beef and trained roping horses. The picture was adorable. Both kids sat on the back of a palomino, with Judd leading the horse, taking the selfie over his shoulder. She hit the heart eye emoji and was just about to send it when she paused, considering the sensations Judd had caused in her that afternoon. She deleted the emoji and sent back a cheesy grin one instead. There. That was neutral. Alice Westbrook slipped into the end seat beside her, holding a tattered book to her chest like a teddy bear. Wynn tossed her a welcoming smile. She was Judd's cousin, somehow. Wynn wasn't quite sure. Alice's parents were in the shady part of the family tree. She had been a couple years behind Wynn in school and was super shy. She nodded Wynn's way and then focused on the front of the room. The meeting droned on, despite the fact that Mayor Jones didn't suffer long bouts of needless questions. She'd allow a couple and then tell people to contact the committee members in charge if they needed more information, providing cell phone numbers. The poor committee members looked like they could use a weekend at the Swiss Bliss Spa on Main Street. Wynn didn't dare leave, for fear she'd miss the one thing, whatever that was, she had to know before the festival started. She'd been the same way in school, refusing to skip class in case there was a pop quiz. It had driven Thatcher nuts, but Judd always stood up for her. She secretly believed that he was relieved not to have to be the one to tell his brother no. Finally, there was a burst of noise as the meeting ended and neighbors started talking. "So," Dorothy stood up and slipped her purse strap over her shoulder. "How's your family?" "We're doing good." Wynn lifted her phone to show Dorothy the image of the kids on the horse. "I'll have 100 questions about why we can't get a horse after this, though." Dorothy took her phone and bent over it. "They've grown so big! Is that—" She dropped her nose closer to the screen. "Judd?" Wynn reached for the phone, needing to have it back immediately. "Yeah, he's babysitting for me tonight." "I always thought he was so cute." "Oh?" Wynn glanced down at her planner and then tucked it into the crook of her arm. She didn't want to talk about Judd and how cute he used to be. Their high school days seemed so long ago, and he'd had horrible taste in girls. She'd hated double dating with him, because he always picked the girls who were too worried about their makeup and hair to play a game of pickup ball or hike to a picnic overlook. "Is he single?" Dorothy glanced away, her cheeks going pink. "Uh-oh." "Yeah, I guess." "You guess?" "I mean, I don't really think about his social life, but I don't think he's dating anyone." She was being vague and had no idea why. Dorothy giggled. "Okay, can you set us up?" Wynn cocked her head. "Like on a date?" "Yes, a date, silly." "Oh my gosh, if we got married, you and I could be sisters-in-law." "Well," her face fell. "Sort of. I mean, I guess you're not, tied to the family anymore now that Thatcher is gone." Wynn barely had time for the sense of indignation to sharpen to a point before Alice cleared her throat. "She's as much of a Westbrook as I am." Her dark brown eyes were fierce. "What if she remarries?" Dorothy tossed out. "There's more to family than bloodlines or last names." Alice bit her lip. She'd had a rough upbringing. Wynn didn't know where her zeal came from because she'd run away from home as soon as she had her diploma and a soft place to land. Dorothy scratched her neck and tugged at her shirt. "Sorry, I didn't mean to offend." "It's okay." Alice lifted her shoulders. Wynn caught her eye and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Alice attempted a smile and then gathered her things quickly and left. Wynn watched her for a moment, but her attention was brought back to Dorothy when she touched her arm. "I really wasn't trying to be insensitive." "It's fine." Wynn brushed her guilt away. She'd gotten good at that. Those kinds of remarks weren't meant to hurt her. Had she married Thatcher not knowing their time was short, she might have felt cheated and bruised when those comments spewed forth. As it was, she'd had a soft whisper from God that she'd done right by Thatcher, and therefore was too confident in wearing his last name to let them bother her. "I just got really excited about the idea of living near you and raising our kids together." "That would be—" Wynn trailed off. Her children were in school now. There wouldn't be playdates and park time. If anything, she'd be the babysitter when Dorothy needed to get out of the house. "Neat," she finished lamely. "So, will you talk to him? See if he's interested in going out?" "I don't really feel comfortable with this," Wynn hedged. What she felt was her skin crawling. Dorothy and Judd, together, kissing? She tried to picture it. Instead of Dorothy leaning into Judd, it was her. No. She mentally slammed the door shut on those thoughts. "But I'll see what I can do," she finished. "Great, let me give you my number." They exchanged a quick hug and phone numbers, and Wynn was off, her heart racing like she'd run through a dark forest at night and barely escaped with her life. Chapter 4. Judd. Judd tossed clothes to his younger brother, Anders, who pitched them down the hall into the open washing machine. "Why are we doing laundry?" Anders asked. "Because if we don't, then Wynn has to do it, and she has enough to do." Judd wadded up the jeans Miles wore to the ranch. He'd stepped in something, and it clung to the pant leg. The machine would get it out. "You might want to add an extra helping of laundry soap to that one." He pointed to the detergent on the shelf above the machine. "Uncle Judd!" Lainey yelled from her room. I'm ready for a story. Her little voice could be heard from miles around. He knew because he'd been in his yard and heard her yelling for her mom inside the house before. Judd grinned. I want one too. Miles raced out of his door, took a sharp left, and ended up on Laney's bed, bouncing on his knees. I got this. Anders unscrewed the cap from the soap and measured it out. A few seconds later, the machine started up. Judd swaggered into the pink and cream-colored room like a cowboy entering a saloon. You want a story, eh? He pretended to spit on the floor. Laney wrinkled her nose in disgust, but Miles grinned. Anders came up behind him, and Judd ducked like he was avoiding a gunshot. He used his fingers to shoot at Anders, who hid behind the door, and fired back. Pew, pew, pew! Miles hollered. Stop fighting! Laney threw her hands over her ears. Both men lowered their weapons and eyed one another as they came to standing. This rascal ate all the tacos. Anders tipped his head at Judd. Didn't save me any. Laney covered her mouth with her hands and giggled. I helped. What? He dove for her on the bed and tickled until she called, Uncle! Judd picked up Miles and set him on his lap. Laney snuggled into Anders, who sat on the bed with his back against the wall. All right, I think Anders should tell you a Thatcher Dad story tonight. Yeah, the kids said in unison. Anders looked up at the ceiling, contemplating. Well, there is one story I'm sure Judd has never told you. Eager blue eyes watched Anders gather his thoughts. Judd took a deep breath and settled in. Hey now, I'm the kid's hero. Don't mess with that. You? Pfft, it's me all the way. Anders winked, and Laney giggled again. She was a veritable factory of giggles since starting school. There was this one time your dad and Judd had to help Auntie Frida clean up some blackberry bushes. They'd been working at it all day, and they came upon an old weight set, the kind you see on TV. The kids nodded. One corner of Judd's mouth twitched with a smile. He'd forgotten about this. So, your uncle here, he tells Auntie Frida they will buy it from her for $50, but she tells them they can have it for free. The two of them hauled it home. Piece by piece, mind you. I still have the calluses on my hand. He pointed to his palm, and the kids leaned over his hand to look. He had calluses, though they'd been earned since that day. Don't feel too bad for him, Anders continued. They cleaned up the set and sold it for $300. And the moral of the story is that hard work always pays off. Judd winked at the kids. Anders laughed. I thought it was that serving others pays off. That too. Judd picked up Miles and threw him over his shoulder. Time for bed, cowpokes. He bent and allowed Laney to kiss his cheek. Night, princess. Night-night. She scooted around and allowed Anders to tuck her in. Judd deposited Miles on his messy bed. The kid couldn't spread out a blanket to save his life. Wynn said that she had to pick her battles with this kid, and that wasn't one she wanted to start. Sleep good, little man. Uncle Judd? Asked a sleepy voice as he turned off the light. Yeah. Love you. Judd clamped his jaw shut, trying to hold back the force of emotions those little words in that little voice brought to the surface. Love you too. He managed to get out. Jeez, he was such a softy. He made his way into the living room and started folding blankets and cleaning up dinner. They'd left for the ranch right after they'd eaten, and the dishes were still on the table. So, what's the latest? Asked Anders. He opened the dishwasher and began stacking dishes on the counter. He'd organized them there and then put them in the cupboards. It was the weirdest way to work, but it was his way. Not much. You? How's Grace? Anders had a longtime girlfriend. The two did everything together. Same. Same? Shouldn't they be heating up? Your shop is done, you have a lot down the street. You two could be married and settled by summer. Anders rubbed the back of his neck. It's not like that. Not like what? I don't know, it's just not. We're good the way we are. That is the strangest thing I've ever heard. If Judd had a girlfriend, he'd be pushing to settle down, live the good life. Anders opened the shipping trunk and stowed the blankets. Not as strange as you living here. Anders fired back, a slice of defensiveness in his voice. I don't live here. Come on, you've got the bedtime routine down. I bet they listen to you more than they do their mother. Judd paused. They kind of did listen to him better. That's only because I'm not really their dad. Anders was quiet for a minute while he sorted silverware. To be honest, I'm a little worried about what will happen to you when they get a new dad. Judd fumbled with the books he'd gathered into his arms. What do you mean? Well, Wynn's going to get remarried someday. Judd's mouth tasted like garbage, and he couldn't work up any spit. Why would she do that? He stuck his head under the faucet and gulped some water down. We all help her out to make up for Thatcher being gone. She doesn't need a husband. She might want a guy to hold her now and again. Unless you're taking care of that, too. Judd grabbed the faucet, pulled the hose out, and squirted Anders. Anders jumped away. Hey! Judd tried to squirt him again. Take it back. What? There's nothing wrong with... Gah! He got a face full of water, cutting off the rest of his words. It didn't happen fast enough. Judd couldn't get the idea of holding Wynn out of his head. Anders marched around the kitchen island and grabbed the towel off the hook. He began twirling it into a snapping weapon. Judd readied the sink. Wynn walked through the garage door and stopped, eyeing the two of them. She held up her palms. All right, guys, I don't know what's going on, but if you make a mess, you're cleaning it up. Judd met Anders' gaze, and they called a silent truce. Wynn breathed out. She glanced around and then brightened. Hey, the place looks great. How much do I owe you? She asked that a lot. Anders replied first. Next time you bake a batch of brownies, I'll take a couple. You got it. She winked at him and turned to Judd. What about you? He studied her face, picturing his hand over her cheek. I'm good. His voice was thick with something he'd rather not name. He turned away, refusing to look at Anders. His brother would read way too much into that look. I'm going to head back to the B&B. Have a good night, you two. Anders fired 2 finger pistols at Judd and ducked out. Judd gritted his teeth. Wynn didn't seem fazed. She set her purse on the counter and turned around, her arms folded. You want to tell me why I walked into a gunfight in my kitchen? He shook his head. Nope. She rolled her eyes. Men. Do you ever think about getting married again? The words tumbled out of him like they'd ridden on a raft down an uncontrollable stretch of river. She braced herself. Why is everyone talking about this tonight? She mumbled. Who? He stumbled. Who talked to you? The very next thought was, and did they mention me? Stupid Anders, putting thoughts in his head. Nobody. She folded her arms and cocked a hip. Do you want to get married? What? Pfft. He struggled to look cool and composed when he felt anything but. You? She rolled her eyes. I'm perfectly content with my life. Good. He folded his arms too, mirroring her posture and meeting her strong gaze. They locked eyes, and the air stopped moving. He didn't need to think because time stood still. They stayed there, just breathing and taking one another in. Wynn's hair was back, but some had escaped the messy bun and framed her face. Her skin was so smooth, and her eyes, they were curious and interested, bright blue and full of heat. There was a shift between them, one he couldn't put words to, but they both felt it. He knew because she jumped into action at the same time he did. She went for the hallway and he went for the door. Night, he called over his shoulder. Good night, she replied. He shut the door but held the handle, wondering what he could do if she came after him. He shut the door but held the handle, wondering what he would do if she came after him. He might, gulp, kiss her. Geez, that would open a can of worms, complicate things, and make a mess. He stayed put, trying to talk himself out of standing there, hopeful and dreading at the same time. Kissing Wynn, the very idea of kissing her, changed things. 30 seconds later, she hadn't come after him. It was a good thing at least one of them had common sense. He let go of the door and walked home. Chapter 5. Wynn. Wynn motioned for Judd to back his truck up a little more. Her vendor tent was in a great place, right on the end of a row near the food vendors. She was next to the organic honey twins, Josie and Allie. Their table displays were beautiful, their busy energy putting bees to shame. Wynn eyed their almost finished booth with envy as she waved to Judd to back up a little more. She had 12 hours until inspection, and if she wasn't set up, she'd have to pay a fine. It wasn't much of a punishment, just $20. Still, she didn't want to be known as the one who wasn't ready on time. The very idea had her blood pressure climbing. She made a fist in the air, and the brake lights came on. Judd and the kids climbed out, and she moved to lower the tailgate in an effort to keep her eyes off of him. Looking at him wasn't so bad if he wasn't looking back. But when their eyes met, strange things happened inside of her. Things like butterflies and nerves, tongue ties and cravings. The kids ran around the grass inside the exhibit tent. She suddenly wished they were in a camping tent, far away, getting ready to roast marshmallows and tell ghost stories, instead of facing the work that lay ahead. Adulting was hard. Thank goodness she had Judd's unwavering help. Their conversation about marriage desires, or lack of them in her case, was weird. They used to talk about his dating life all the time. When had that become awkward between them? Her mind bounced to the night of Thatcher's funeral. Judd had walked into the house and found her teary-eyed, holding her babies. He'd sat next to her, taken Miles onto his lap, and they just existed in their shared grief. Being with someone who understood her pain, didn't try to talk her into feeling better, but lifted her load was just what she'd needed. He came the next night, and the next. One night, he walked in and she had dinner ready for them all, just like she used to when Thatcher was alive. It was normal and as full of holes as a jack-o'-lantern. Judd hadn't pointed it out, though. He just went with it. And when she broke down halfway through the meal and ran for her room, he finished up with the kids and then did the dishes. They'd continued on from there, and all talk of dating, and as far as she knew, actual dating, ended as Judd became the man her children looked to for strength and stability. "Hey," he called to the kids, "stay close." They didn't acknowledge hearing him, but came back from the edge of the booth near the organic honey. No doubt they were tempted by the beautiful bottles of honey-related self-care products like perfume, foot balm, hair cream, and body butter. There was a cute sign that said, "Anti-aging" on one end of the table. Wynn needed to pick up some creams because this starting a business thing created wrinkles by the hour. She'd look like a total hag by the time the festival was over. "What's first?" Judd wiggled his hand into a leather glove. Wynn pushed her hair off her face and let out a breath. "I don't even know." "What do you mean you don't know?" He glanced from his loaded truck back to her. "I made all this stuff. I just don't know how to arrange it pretty. I've been stacking it all in the garage and off the patio to make room. Her voice had gone so high she ran out of oxygen and had to gulp in air. They had this load and then 2 more, along with a bunch of stuff she didn't plan on putting out until things sold. What had she gotten herself into? Judd scratched his head. "Maybe start with the rugs?" "Yes." "Right, rugs went on the ground, under furniture. That's a great idea." They were on grass, but allowed to put down carpets to protect the furniture. By the time the festival was over, the grass would be dormant anyway, so the city didn't care much what they did to it now. They reached for a rug at the same time, their bodies coming together and his arm brushing hers. He jumped back. "Sorry, you go ahead." Wynn ignored the way her heart buzzed at his nearness and grabbed the end of the rolled carpet, tugging with all her might. It slipped out and she tumbled back, right into Judd. He grunted and wrapped his arms around her to keep them both from falling. "Sorry," she cried out, doing her best to get back on her feet. His hand slipped across Wynn's stomach, and her knees buckled. She was hot and panting embarrassingly loudly. "Mom!" Miles ran over, his eyes wide. "I'll help." He got under the end of the carpet and pushed up, his face turning red. At the sight, Wynn was able to pull her focus off the feel of Judd's solid body behind her and get back on neutral ground. "Thanks, bud." Judd pushed her up from behind and her knees cooperated, thank goodness. "I want to help too." Lainey had her hands on her hips and looked to be about 3 seconds away from a foot stomp. Wynn laughed and tugged her ponytail. "Then get over here and roll this out." The kids knelt down and pushed at the rug until it was completely flat. Lainey fell over herself and landed on her stomach. Judd picked her up and swung her around, both of them laughing. Wynn studied the rug. The deep reds, oranges, and browns looked great against the cream backdrop and utilized the fall theme of the festival in a classy way. "Maybe if we get the rest of the stuff off the truck, your creativity will kick in," Judd offered. "Yeah, and maybe my fairy godmother will show up and I'll get to go to the ball." He laughed. "There is no ball, just a barn dance every weekend with a $5 cover fee." Wynn glared at him. "You're not helping." She softened. "Except you're pretty much my whole moving crew, so I take that back." His eyes twinkled. "I prefer the term muscle man." "I'll bet you do." She looked him over out of the corner of her eye. "Yoo-hoo!" Dorothy waved from the front of the truck. "Wynn?" She walked around the back and stopped short at the sight of Judd flexing for Wynn. I wanted to say hi." Wynn suddenly realized how close she was standing to Judd and stepped away. "Dorothy, how's it going?" Her cheeks heated and she pressed her hands to them in an effort to cool them off. "So good. Did you see the entrance? I'm so in love with the way it turned out." She flapped her hand in front of her chest. "It's so beautiful," Wynn gushed in an effort to take the focus off her and Judd. She'd talk about pumpkins and foliage all day long if it would keep Dorothy from drooling over Judd. "I loved the gold accents." Her hands went to her hips. "I wish I had half your abilities. I have no idea how I'm going to make this stuff look presentable." Dorothy's eyes darted around, taking in the carpet and Wynn's children lying spread eagle on it, and then the items piled in the truck. "I have some time. Do you want help?" "Yes, she does," Judd answered for her. Wynn whipped her head around to look at him. He gave her one of his scoundrel smiles in return and then spoke to Dorothy. "She won't admit it, so I have to do it for her, but she could use a design consultation." Wynn glared up at him, and at the same time felt her confidence drop 3 levels. If it had been anyone but Dorothy, she would have been on her knees begging for help. But for some reason, she didn't want to look less than when standing next to her. Judd comparing Dorothy's best trait with Wynn's worst one? That was a blow. Dorothy trailed her hand along the side of the truck as she took stock. "This is beautiful. Did you make this?" she asked Judd. "Nope, this is all Wynn." He grabbed 2 of the step stools, one in blue and one in gray, and hauled them off the truck. "She's the designer, builder, and finisher." Dorothy pushed herself up on the tailgate and grabbed an end table, setting it at the edge for Judd. "I'm super impressed." She winked at Wynn, letting her know that it wasn't Wynn's workmanship she admired at the moment. When Judd turned away to put the table aside, Dorothy fanned her face. Wynn's heart sank. Here Dorothy was, helping her out and trying to score points with Judd. Allowing her to continue felt dirty and underhanded. Why did she have to be nice? Ugh. Wynn's insides pulled in different directions, and she scrambled to keep it together as she unloaded items. It took all 3 of them to muscle the bar-height farm table and matching benches down without causing damage to human, truck, or table. The price tag was almost as hefty as the 8x8 beams she'd used for legs. It took all 3 of them grunting mightily to get it off the truck. "How'd you get this in here?" Dorothy asked as she swiped her brow. She didn't have anything to worry about. She had a nice glow, but no sweat. Wynn, on the other hand, was drenched. "Anders helped," she panted, and then heard herself and clamped her mouth shut. "Oh, how's he doing?" She leaned against the table, looking like a poster girl for the whole festival. Judd answered easily. "Great. His new shop is built. He's already taken on several orders." "What's he building?" "Furniture, custom doors, and cabinets. You name it." She lifted one perfect eyebrow. "Is there some competition in the family?" Wynn snorted. "Not likely. He uses walnut and applewood. I'm more of a pine and plywood girl." Anders had all the tools, routers, jigs, even a lathe. She didn't have the patience to work for hours to turn a bedpost like he did, so their markets were completely different. Besides, being able to build with rough lumber was a passion Anders didn't possess. Not many people could look at a 2x4 and see a coffee table. "I'm going to get another load. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Judd shut the tailgate. "We'll have this set up by then." Dorothy smiled at him like he'd been the one to discover pumpkin bread. He dipped his chin and jumped into the truck. "Kids, want to go hang out at Grandma's?" Lainey and Miles cheered. So far, they'd been good about sticking close, but their patience was growing thin, especially since there was a whole festival to explore. Wynn blew them kisses as they climbed into the truck and waved goodbye. Dorothy let out a happy sigh. "Well, that went well." She winked at Wynn as she spun slowly to take in the assorted pieces. "I have to say, this table is a showstopper. It's absolutely perfect." Wynn didn't want to ask why Dorothy thought things had gone so well with Judd. She could imagine what the girl had in mind, and she didn't like it one bit. She chose to focus on the compliment that Dorothy dished out. "Thanks so much. I'm so proud of it I could burst." "Let's scoot it back and get the benches in place. Then we can build around it." They got to work. The table was heavy and had to be duck-walked along. Once it was deeper in the tent, Dorothy wanted the outdoor couch on the right and 2 Adirondack chairs facing with their coffee table in between. If people can picture the furniture in their space and how it will be used, it will be easier for them to decide they want it. "I just want to make it as easy as possible for them." Wynn brushed her hands down her jeans and then tugged at the knot holding a hoodie around her middle. She needed to put it on now that the heavy lifting was done. Dorothy placed 2 lanterns of different heights on the coffee table and stepped back to look. She tapped her chin. "You need some bits." "Bits?" "Pumpkins, leaves, garlands, even Halloween decorations will do." Wynn's heart sank. "I didn't think of any of that." "No worries, I have some stuff left over from doing the entry. I'll be back in a jiff." Wynn picked up a mirror. She'd framed it, etching the word "beautiful" into the bottom right corner. She leaned the whole thing against the table bench and stepped back. Now that things were set up, a few ideas began to pop into her head. She dug into the box of small projects and arranged 3 sets of coasters on the coffee table in stacks, putting them slightly off-center. 3 cutting boards, set at an angle, went atop the big table. She'd done matching cheese boards with resin, and the colors popped against the wood. A couple of wooden spoons were laid out beautifully. She continued to lay out items until Dorothy got back with a wheelbarrow full of pumpkins, ribbons, twine, and tin buckets. "Hey, those are great!" Wynn held up a wooden spoon with an angled end, great for scraping the bottom of a pan. She should know, she had an identical one in her kitchen. It was Judd's favorite. "Thanks, the spoons were my first project. I guess you could say I started small and went big." She spread her hand out to encompass the furniture. Dorothy handed her a stack of buckets. "See if you can find spots for these. You don't happen to make cake stands, too, do you?" "I have a couple I made out of tree stumps in the garage. I can text Judd to make sure he grabs them." "Perfect. They'll add some height." She set aside a couple pumpkins and then walked around, draping a swath of fabric here and winding a garland there. The display was really starting to come together. He says he found them. Wynn looked up from the screen. Anything else? Her stress level had gone down by 75%. More resin pieces if you have them, she typed. So, Dorothy played with some sticks that were spray-painted gold. She put them in one place, shook her head, and then moved them to another. Did you have a chance to talk to Judd about me? Wynn's phone flipped out of her hand, and she scrambled to grab it in the air. It landed on the grass. She'd had the chance, but had she taken it? Not really. Dorothy's face fell. Guilt was an ugly friend, one that Wynn didn't want. I'm sorry, I've been really busy with all this, but I promise I'll do it. Her brain screamed at her for agreeing to do something she didn't think was a good idea in the first place. But she couldn't say no, not after Dorothy put in an hour helping her get organized and look professional. Dorothy was being a great friend, and Wynn would be a horrible one if she didn't at least talk to Judd about a date. The man in the middle of the mud puddle in her brain took that moment to arrive. He parked and opened the door, the scent of pizza billowing out of the truck. Both women stopped and sniffed. Wynn's mouth began to water. She could already taste the sausage, peppers, and pepperoni, Judd's standard order. Oh, pizza, you temptress, you. A green box with a white stripe preceded him out of the car. You splurged on Wicked Dough? She cried. There were a couple pizza places in town, but Wicked Dough was the most expensive, and the best. They only ordered from there on special occasions. Every other pizza night was a take and bake. He grinned. I thought we could celebrate your future success. He looked over the booth, his eyebrows climbing. Wynn stepped beside him, her arm brushing his, and tried to see what he saw. Though her furniture was beautiful on its own, the added pops of fall color made everything come to life. Her booth looked like something in a magazine. Judd patted her back. This looks really good. You got a lot done. Wynn's heart sank, and her mouth filled with grit and sand, making it difficult to get the next words out. It wasn't me. Dorothy is the decorating whiz. She's like a tornado of organization. Why was it so hard to be nice? Judd turned to Dorothy, giving her his full and undivided attention as if he were looking at her for the first time. Sounds like you earned the first slice of celebratory pizza. He lifted the lid and applied a smile, one that Wynn had seen several times. She'd never thought of it as roguish before, but the effect on Dorothy was unmistakable. I don't mind if I do, Dorothy replied as she lifted out a slice and winked at Judd. Wynn's appetite drifted into no man's land, where dried leaves blew like tumbleweeds. She turned from the two of them as they laughed about the stringy cheese flopping down Dorothy's pert chin and made her way to the back of the truck to unload her wares. Focusing on her booth and the life she was building for herself and her kids was what she needed. She didn't have a claim on Judd, nor a say in who he spent his time with. So, why did it feel like her world was suddenly unstable? Chapter 6. Judd. Later that night, Judd stepped out of his truck and arched his back, groaning. He glanced through the cab and saw Wynn watching him from the passenger seat, her mouth set in a saucy smirk. He rolled his eyes. Yeah, I know I sounded like my dad, okay? You don't have to rub it in. More like your grandpa. She put her arms up and groaned. Hey, Sonny, can you get the remote off of the coffee table there? Grandpa doesn't bend so good anymore, she said, in a bad imitation of a creaky old man voice. He shut his door, cutting off her cackle. Good. At least she was laughing now. She'd been so stressed earlier, he'd been sure she'd break into tears. If there was one thing he couldn't stand, it was seeing Wynn cry. He headed for the family entrance to his parents' B&B to collect the kids. It was past 11, and Wynn would need help carrying their sleeping forms into the house. Getting them to bed could be a challenge, but once they were asleep, the fire alarms could go off, and they wouldn't flutter an eyelid. Judd, wait. Wynn pushed out of the cab and hurried around to the front of the truck, her feet knocking the gravel around. She stopped short and tucked her hair behind her ear, a sure sign she was working herself up to something. Her cheeks flushed, and Judd's breath caught at the sight. "Yes?" he croaked out. The sound of his voice faltering caught his attention, and he cleared his throat. "Yeah?" She lifted her shoulders and twisted her fingers in front of her. "What did you think of Dorothy?" Judd relaxed. "She did a great job. I really like the booth." He moved to touch her forearm. "You don't need to worry. Your furniture is going to sell like Presley's chocolate Santas the day before Christmas." "No." She looked up as if searching for the words in the stars. "I mean, what did you think of her? Do you like her?" Judd scrunched up one side of his face. "Like her?" "Yeah, would you want to go out with her or something?" "No," he blurted before thinking. Wynn's mouth dropped open and then snapped shut again. "But you spent all night flirting with her." "I did not." A sense that he was being unjustly accused rode over the top of him, making his tone tight. "Why would you say that?" She dug her hand into her hip. "Because it's true. You two laughed, you made jokes, you even offered to carry the side table for her so she wouldn't break a nail." He threw his thumb at his chest. "I was being a gentleman." She studied him. He kept his face passive, though his head screamed at him to set her straight. "Friends joke around." She dug her fingers into her hair. "Ugh, why are you so upset?" "Because you're accusing me of going after another woman." Her eyes grew large, reflecting the half moon hanging in the sky, and he realized what he'd just said. "I mean, you're making this into something it's not." She dropped her hands to her sides, and a gust of wind left her lungs. "Would you go out with her?" What?" Judd sputtered. She composed herself, standing taller and looking him in the eye. "She asked me to set you two up. What should I tell her?" Judd paused to consider his words. Not something he usually did, but it seemed important not to screw this up. He reached for Wynn's hand and brushed his thumb over her skin. It was warm, and a current began to hum up his arm, but he didn't let go. "Tell her my life is full." "Full?" "I have kids and—" Gulp. "You? My business? I can't even think about starting a relationship with anyone. My life is full, in the best way." Wynn should never think she was a burden. She wasn't. She'd brought all good things into his day, every day. She glanced down at their hands and whispered, "Okay." He gave her a light squeeze and then let go. "Okay, let's get the kids in their own beds. You have an early day tomorrow." She lifted her chin. "First day of the festival. It's gonna be crazy." He forced his voice to take on a cheery lilt. "Crazy awesome. You're going to kill it." She smiled, though the curve of her lips was weighted with exhaustion. "I just hope I don't fall flat on my face in front of the whole town. You know how people are about the festival. It's our window to the world." She waved one arm as if writing the slogan in the air in front of her. "I'm not worried." He winked and then pushed his way through the back door and into the mudroom. Wynn was a step behind him, but he still heard her mutter, "That makes one of us." He smiled to himself. She'd succeed, even if he had to buy every piece of furniture in her booth. Chapter 7. Wynn. The first week of the festival flew by in a blur of morning chores, bus stop conversations with the kids, and talking to visitors as they browsed her booth. By the time Saturday night rolled around, Wynn was ready for a bubble bath with a diet soda and her Kindle. But that wasn't in the cards. She had a long night of chit-chat and answering questions about the glaze she'd used on the tabletop. No one had so much nibbled at her showstopper. It might be too much to ask of fate to sell it in the first 5 days, but she'd hoped. If she sold that table, she'd break even, and the pressure would be off. "Hey, sis." Wynn spun to find Brody standing next to the outdoor couch, his hands tucked in his front pockets. The oldest Westbrook was tall, dark, and handsome, with blue eyes that electrified anyone who dared look in them. When he came to the family, there weren't many who had the chance. He'd come home to say goodbye to his dying brother, but there was no telling why he stayed. Wynn was the one exception to his familial avoidance issues. He came over to Wynn's for the occasional dinner, would babysit if she asked, and often mowed her lawn when she wasn't looking. He liked to pretend it wasn't his, but she knew his mowing pattern. He was the only one who went in diagonal lines. "Brody!" She hugged him like the older brother she'd never had. "What are you doing here? Are you on a date?" She glanced over his shoulder, but there wasn't a pretty woman waiting for introductions. He laughed. "I came to give you the night off." "What? No! You should check out the used book section or something. Wander around, find the ladies." He laughed again. "The fact you think the ladies hang out in the used book section is very telling of your social life." She shook her head and shoved him. "Don't knock it. If you want a smart woman, you gotta go where the books are." "I don't care how smart she is, as long as she can ski." "Ugh, you and skiing." Brody lived for winter, claiming it was the only time of year he felt free. Wynn wholeheartedly disagreed. Winter was for freezing and staying indoors with lots of hot chocolate. "You'd better find a woman who loves it as much as you do, or your future marriage is doomed." "Ugh, you and marriage," he teased back. "Everyone but you has to tie the knot." "Because I already did." She shoved his shoulder. "It's great. You should try it out." He made a face like he'd taken a bite of pie, expecting pumpkin and getting lemon. She laughed, and a bit of her stress slipped away. Maybe a night off wasn't such a bad thing. "Well, if you're willing to stick around here all night, I'm going to catch up with the family at the corn maze." As soon as the words were out, she wished she could take them back. Unless you want to go, they'd love to have you." He cocked his head. "You and I both know that's not true." It was true. Scott's eyes told the story of losing his oldest son. It haunted him. Healing family scars took a lot of time. If marrying Thatcher had taught her anything, it was that nothing was a guarantee in this world. Not seeing your children grow up, and not fixing wounds inflicted by loved ones. The stubborn set to Brody's jaw told her that nothing was going to heal tonight. "All right, there's a price list by the register and everything is clearly marked." After a quick tutorial on how to run a credit card through the machine, she headed off in the direction of the corn maze. Instead of telling everyone she was coming, she decided to surprise them. Music pumped through speakers throughout the craft booths and then faded away as she reached the food vendors. Here there were scents and smells that had her stomach rumbling. Fried cheese, fried Oreos, fried hot dogs, French fries, and funnel cakes. And those were just the foods that started with F. Apple pie, Boston cream donuts, chocolate-covered bananas. The festival was a dieter's nightmare and dream come true all in one. She gazed longingly at the bratwurst vendor who had a line of 15 people eagerly awaiting an onion and green pepper smothered brat and a soda. Dinner could wait a while, though. She had the whole night to herself and a crisp 50 in her pocket from selling a set of 3 lanterns. She approached the small ticket booth at the start of the corn maze. Maybe it was time to text someone and let them know she was here. Judd, Anders, and Bertie were somewhere inside with the kids. Surprising them would be fun, but not if she spent the whole night looking for them and never finding them. She pulled out her phone and looked down just as Miles slammed into her legs and wrapped his arms around them. "Mom!" The smile that spread across her face was written by love. "Buddy!" She hugged him and held out an arm for Lainey to hug her too. They wore sweaters and mittens, but no coats. Nighttime got nippy, but not bad enough to pull out the winter coats. "I thought you were working." Miles set his chin on her hip as he talked. She cupped the back of his head. "Uncle Brody gave me the night off." She glanced up to make sure Judd had heard. Brody should get credit for his good deed. He didn't acknowledge her statement either way, but the smile he'd had when their eyes met stayed bright. Lainey bounced. "You can play?" "I can play," she replied, matching her daughter's level of excitement. Bertie bounded over. At 17, the girl was willow-thin and full of grace. She'd be off to college next year and taking the world by storm, no doubt. "Fantastic! Now we even have teams." "Where's Grace?" Wynn asked Anders. She was usually up for some family fun time. "She had class tonight," Anders answered easily. "That's right. She's just got this semester and she's done?" For as long as Wynn could remember, Grace had been taking night classes. It cut into the couple's time together, but Anders was super supportive and never complained. He was almost too calm about all of it, like it didn't bother him to be apart from her. Wynn shoved those thoughts away. Anders and Grace had been together for a long time, and people got comfortable with one another. That was all. "Yep." Anders rocked on his heels. "So," Wynn rolled her hands over one another. This should be where Anders said something about proposing and finally getting on with their lives. She wanted nieces and nephews for the love. Being part of a big family should mean cousins galore. "So then she can get the promotion at the ski resort," replied Anders, scratching the back of his neck. Wynn rolled her eyes. Judd gave her a nudge from behind, his gentle signal not to push it. "Who's up for maze tag?" He rubbed his palms together. The kids cheered. Wynn groaned. "Not me. I'm so tired." "No worries." Bertie grabbed Lainey's hand. "This one's on my team." "I get miles." Anders offered the boy a fist bump. "I guess it's you and me," Judd said, pointing at her. "We're it." Wynn offered a small smile. At least with an adult as a partner, she wouldn't have to run pell-mell through the maze and fake a level of enthusiasm she didn't have. "We'll give you guys a head start." She covered her eyes and started counting to 10. "Come on!" Miles yelled. Finding them shouldn't be that hard. Their noise level was a dead giveaway. Footsteps receded into the maze, and Wynn dropped her hands from her eyes. She laughed at Judd, who was counting with his hands over his ears. 10. He dropped his hands and pointed to the right and left. "Which way?" She listened for a moment and then pointed left. They started in at a walk, not expecting to find anyone. "How are things going? I feel like I've hardly seen you this week." Judd glanced down at her from the corner of his eye. "Good. We got the remodel on Main Street done, so that's good." "I can't believe what a pain it turned out to be." "It would have been half the pain if Mr. Wazalewski didn't yell at us every time we used a power tool." In his defense, you guys did knock out power when he was in the shower. Mr. Wazalewski lived in the apartment above the new business. "We tripped a breaker, and we had it fixed before he came flying down the stairs in a towel." Judd shuddered. "That's a mental image I can't erase." "Ack, you didn't tell me that." Wynn covered her eyes. "Now I'm seeing it too. Thanks a lot." He laughed. Wynn cocked her head and put her finger over his lips, silencing Judd's laughter. Giggles sounded straight ahead. She stepped lighter, creeping up on the turn, Judd right behind her. He made less sound than she did, his big boots not even crunching the grass. She held up 3 fingers, then dropped one, then the next, and then the last one. Drawing a deep breath, she pounced around the corner and tagged Lainey's shoulder. "You're it!" Adrenaline pushed through her veins, and she kicked it into gear and ran past Bertie, who swiped to tag her back. Behind her, Judd grunted and dodged too. The race was on. She might have been tired, but Bertie couldn't leave Lainey behind or the tag wouldn't count. "There!" Judd put his hand on her back and gently pushed her toward an alcove. It was a dead end, a tiny space barely big enough for her to fit. It must have been a mistake in the design that the tractor driver couldn't correct. Judd shoved in after her, his back to the opening. "Judd!" She wiggled, hemmed in by itchy, dry corn husks and his body. "Shh." He put his arms around her and stepped closer, looking over his shoulder. The scent of dryer sheets and sawdust filled her nose, followed quickly by something that was unique to Judd. a manliness that woke up parts of her she hadn't known existed anymore. Her hands splayed on his sweater, all soft and well-worn, as she contemplated pushing him back into the alley versus burying her nose in his neck. Dang, he smelled so good. The kind of good that got people into trouble. Lainey approached, telling Birdie that she wanted to be a princess for Halloween. Judd tucked in tighter, his cheek brushing Wynn's as he tried to shield her from view. Wynn's hand went up his neck and rested against his pounding pulse, a heartbeat to match her own. Her breathing became heavy and fast, not the kind of breathlessness that came from running through a maze, but the type that preceded something wonderful. Lainey and Birdie passed, and a few seconds later Judd pulled back to look at Wynn.
I think we're safe.
His eyes took her in, running across her face and landing on her lips. Heat swirled inside of her in a delicious and totally new way, and she almost whimpered. The sound built so quickly that she had to bite her tongue to keep it from escaping. They were not safe. She wasn't safe in his arms, not when so many feelings happened all at once. She would careen out of control. Judd lifted his eyes to meet hers. Maybe he saw the panic. Maybe he realized what a precarious situation they were suddenly in with his arms around her and her chest heaving like some Regency romance heroine. Or maybe he didn't feel the same way. Whatever the reason, he backed up. Turning away from her so he could check the path for the kids, he grabbed her hand.
Come on, if we can make it to the end before we're tagged, we'll win.
He tugged and she followed on unsteady feet. Her knees were weak, and she wobbled like a toddler learning to walk. It was a good thing that he knew the way because Wynn's thoughts were stuck back in that cubby. What in the world had happened? Had she really considered kissing Judd? No. There hadn't been a single solitary thought in her brain at the time. She'd just felt. And what amazing things to feel. She'd been married, had 2 kids, but nothing prepared her for the surge of longing that pooled in her lower belly when Judd pulled her close. Alive. That was it. She'd felt so alive. Losing Thatcher wasn't a surprise, but part of her lay in the grave with him. That was normal, according to the articles she'd read and the other widows she'd spoken to. So was her desire to be single, especially after caring for Thatcher's private physical needs for months. Taking that on again would be too much for this life. Doing the craft fair brought to light a part of herself she hadn't known existed. In high school, when asked when she wanted to be, she always said, a mom. It wasn't the popular answer. School counselors frowned and shook their heads, but she couldn't lie. So the need and desire to have a business seemed to come out of the blue. Yet, it was the right path. That was certain. So what the heck was this thing with Judd? She glanced down at their entwined fingers, hardly believing they were locked together like that. They stumbled to the finish line, and a scream pierced the air and her brain fog. She dropped Judd's hand and ducked her head so she didn't have to look at him. Birdie and Lainey hit the finish line, their hands raised in triumph. Anders and Miles were right on their heels. "We won!" Lainey clapped. Birdie picked her up and spun her around, making Lainey laugh. "You were so fast!"
"We call a rematch," said Anders, his hands on his hips as he tried to catch his breath. "After I get some cider, I'm going to get you, Birdie. That was sneaky."
Birdie laughed too. "You'll have to catch me first, old man." She sidestepped his hand. "Oh, can't catch me." Wynn grinned. "You two are horrible examples for my children." The adults turned to see Miles and Lainey watching their aunt and uncle horse around, their mouths hanging slightly open. "But I love it. Come on, cider is on me." She placed her arm around her daughter and used Lainey as a shield between her and Judd. She needed some space to figure out what was going on with her. She wasn't the type of woman who threw herself at a man, And if she found herself wrapped up in Judd's arms again, she might do something they'd both regret. Years of friendship and trust would crumble in a kiss.
Chapter 8. Judd. Today's the big day. Judd paced the judging stand. There were 6 entries for the state's biggest pumpkin competition, and his was on the end, right next to his cousin's. The 2 pumpkins looked identical in size. There was no way to tell which one weighed more until the competition later that morning. The other pumpkins were close seconds. Unless one of them was full of lead, he and Wyatt were the only 2 contenders. The sun wasn't up yet, and the world was painted in muted fall colors like a photoshopped photograph. Judd crept through the grass, keeping one eye out for his competition. This is so James Bond. Wynn had Lainey on her hip, the girl still in pajamas. The 2 tracked behind them, silent as deer in the mist. Miles was still in the truck, snoozing so deeply that they couldn't wake him to come look at the entrance. "I've never seen this side of you. What's your motivation?" She joined him as he glanced around the last real cover they had before making a run to the giant pumpkin patch. "Wyatt didn't bring his pumpkin until late last night, and I was watching the kids, so I couldn't check it out." He pulled up short in front of his cousin's entry. Glaring at the behemoth, he asked, "Does it look bigger than mine?" Wynn snorted a laugh. "Your pumpkin is the biggest pumpkin in Harvest Ranch." "In the whole world!" Lainey threw her arms out to the side. Her little voice was big in the pre-dawn stillness. Judd pulled a tape measure out of his pocket. "Help me measure this." Wynn set Lainey down. "Stay close." She took the tape and stood next to cream-colored flesh. Giant pumpkins weren't always orange, but Judd preferred his that way. Wyatt must have gone with a hybrid. "There's no way your cousin grew a bigger pumpkin this year." "You'll win the trophy, Uncle Judd." Lainey's encouragement was like candy corn. It came in a small package and was always appreciated. "Thanks, P. I couldn't have grown this without your help." She beamed, her pigtails swinging, and his worries lessened. All summer, the 2 of them had watered, turned, babied, fertilized, and fretted over the 3 giant pumpkins in his garden. Well, garden might be a generous term. The only thing he grew was the pumpkins for the contest. Maybe next year he'd try peppers or something, so Lainey could have the pride that came with putting food on the table. "Even if we don't win, I'm glad we got to do this together." Wynn gave him one of her "my heart is melting" looks. She did that sometimes when he said things to the kids that got to her. It made him feel like Superman, and he lifted his chest. Before he could say anything else, he reached the end of his tape measure. Shoot. He put his arm around the hull and searched for Wynn's fingers. She gasped as their skin brushed. A shock went up his arm, but he didn't pull away. It was a nice jolt, like waking up and realizing it was Christmas morning. He hooked his hand around hers and held on. "Are your arms all the way out?" "Mostly," came her muffled reply. She must have been facing the pumpkin. He frowned, letting go of her hand. "Okay, let's do ours again." "Ours?" She folded her arms. "I want it on the record that I did not participate in this. I am neutral ground here." "What? No way. You're clearly on Team Judd." She rolled her eyes and stuck her tongue out. "I want the cousins to like me, okay? That's why Stephanie and I stay out of your weird rivalry." "It's not weird." He and Wyatt were the same age, same height. They always had been, and it drove them both nuts growing up. Grandpa would line them up against the wall at every family gathering and lay a ruler over their 2 heads. They never gained so much as a 1/16 of an inch on each other. "I've entered this competition every year since my junior year of high school. He didn't have to copy me." She rolled her eyes and muttered, "Children." He grinned. Her tone said she wasn't all that upset with him. When he'd roused the house this morning, he'd expected some resistance. What he hadn't expected was the feeling of intimacy that surrounded him when he walked into her bedroom. She was so beautiful in her sleep, her eyelashes resting heavily on her cheeks, and her full lips slightly opened as she breathed deeply. He'd had to backtrack and get Lainey so she could wake up her mom, because he didn't dare touch Wynn for fear of what it would stir inside of him. He'd had way too many stirrings when it came to Lynn as of late. If he were smart, he would have called her instead of walking in, but he always walked in her house as if he lived there too. Standing in her bedroom, knowing he didn't belong but wanting to, told him that sleeping next door was the best option, the only option. They stretched the tape, and he reached for her hand. This time, she was also grabbing for his, and his heart sped up. "Well?" he asked. The tape measure dropped, and she leaned around the pumpkin. Her forehead wrinkled. They felt the same. "So it comes down to weight." He let go of her hand and wound up the tape. "What time is the official competition?" asked Wynn. "Noon." "High noon," she said. Then she made her hands into guns and pretended to shoot them in the air. "You feelin' lucky, punk?" He charged, growling because she was teasing him, and he liked it. She took off at a sprint. Lainey screamed to wake the dead and ran with her mom back to the truck. He slowed to a jog, laughing. "We'll see who's walking out of here with a shiny trophy and who's just walking out." "Either way, I'm going to need food before then." Wynn lifted Lainey into the back seat and then climbed in. "Food?" Miles mumbled in his sleep, his eyes fluttering open. "Do I smell bacon?" Judd exchanged a look with Wynn, and they laughed. "I guess we're off to the Blue Shadow Cafe for pancakes and bacon." He put the truck in gear. Saturday mornings were his favorite. He loved the slower pace and the sleepy, bed-headed kids. Life was good. There was no sense messing it up by starting to have feelings for Wynn. His head knew this, but his hand itched to hold hers as they drove to the diner. By the time they ate, went home and dressed, and made it back to the judging station, a large crowd milled about, waiting for things to get started. "Do you mind if we cruise past my booth to check on Bertie? She opened on her own this morning, and I want to make sure she's okay." Judge hedged and checked his watch. "It won't take long," Wynn promised. "Besides, you know there's going to be a speech before they announce the winner." Everything with the festival had to have some kind of ceremony. The weekly parade started with the mayor's speech and announcing the grand marshal. The corn maze opened with a ribbon cutting, and the giant pumpkin contest always started with a word from the sponsor. "Okay, but I don't want to be late. I need to be up front when they call my name." Wynn cocked her head. "What?" He swiped at his face to make sure he hadn't left syrup on his chin. "Nothing. I just think it's cute that you're putting on a brave face when I know you're worried." She touched his arm, causing his breath to snag. "You have nothing to worry about. This competition is in the bag." Wynn sashayed ahead of him. He hung back, worried on a whole new level now. Wynn said nice things to people all the time, but when she directed them at him, well, it made him want to do things like lift cars off of old men and stop bank robberies. They made it to the booth, which was crowded with people browsing the wares. Judd nodded with approval. The weekend rush was good for business, and if the exclamations from the women around him were any indication, they found Wynn's furniture impressive. "I'm doing great. Everyone is so nice." Bertie grinned at a customer who glanced over, unintentionally listening in on their conversation. "It couldn't be helped, not in these close quarters." "You should bring out a few more of these fall decorations. They're selling fast. We're almost out of pumpkins." Wynn pulled out her phone and made some notes. "I'm taking that as a good sign for you today," Wynn said with a wink in Judd's direction. "Do you need anything?" she asked Bertie. "I'll take a dirty Dr. Pepper when you come back this way." "You got it." Wynn made another note of the drink order. Judd watched her. She'd make a great manager. Not only did she listen to her employee, but she took care of her as well. Bertie gave him a quick side hug. "Good luck. I hope you beat the pants off Wyatt." Judd dropped his chin to his chest. "I'm not out to beat Wyatt." He hadn't said a word to anyone about wanting to win over his cousin, except Wynn. But she wouldn't have said anything, would she? He narrowed his eyes in her direction.
She crossed her heart and zipped her fingers across her lips. Bertie poked him in the ribs. Sure you're not. Just like when you both entered the science fair, the 4-H competition, and asked Stephanie to homecoming. He scowled. We gotta go. Bertie laughed, knowing she'd hit a nerve, and waved them off. Little sisters are a pain in the... He cut off at the feel of Miles's little hand grabbing his. Glancing over, he caught Wynn stifling her smile. Stinker. She'd probably told Miles to grab his hand and stop his tirade about little sisters and their annoying habits. His eyes darted to Lainey holding Wynn's hand, and his momentary irritation smoothed out. He wouldn't want Miles to say anything bad about Lainey. Ugh. Being a role model was not easy, but he wouldn't change his place in their lives for anything. They reached the back of a growing crowd of people, and Judd stood on his toes to see over the top of their heads. Wyatt's up front. Come on. He picked up Lainey and grabbed Wynn's hand, doing his best to ignore all the wonderful sensations spiraling up his arm and around his chest. She grabbed onto Miles, and they weaved their way through the crowd to stand by Wyatt. Hey. Judd gave him a chin jerk as a hello. How's it going? Wyatt glanced from him to his and Wynn's clasped hands. Pretty good. You? Can't complain. Judd let go of Wynn and moved Lainey to his other hip. Where's your family? Wyatt and Stephanie... Yes, Wyatt had gotten the date to homecoming and then married the girl. Had a boy Lainey's age. They were in the same class at school and got along great. It would be fun for them to hang out together for a bit. They're, late. Judd's something up radar went woo-ee, woo-ee. Oh, here they come. Wyatt jerked his chin toward the side of the crowd where Stephanie plowed through. Jaden trailed behind, dragging his cowboy boots through the dirt. You made it, Wyatt welcomed them. He reached out for Stephanie, but she brushed him off. Yeah, we're here. Judd blinked at her sharpness. Wynn looked away as if embarrassed to witness a private moment. Hey, Judd, Wynn, Stephanie said in a much more pleasant tone. It's good to see you guys. You too, Wynn said through a too-bright smile. Do you want to stand with Jaden? She asked Lainey. Lainey nodded and wiggled down to be with her buddy. Miles pushed forward to be included, and the kids started talking about the carnival and the corn maze. The tension between the adults relaxed. Welcome, boomed Audrey Capulet into the portable mic. The woman was an ex-cheerleader for the San Francisco 49ers. She didn't need a mic at all. Judd rubbed his right ear to get rid of the ringing. Why are we standing up front? Challenged Stephanie. Wyatt pressed his lips together and shook his head in response. The tension hiked back up to 30 on the uncomfortable scale. Judd stepped between the unhappy couple and Wynn in an effort to shield her from their sourness. With the kids chatting away, it was impossible to move to another section and leave these two behind without making a major scene. Sheesh. We're here to crown this year's... She giggled. Sorry, wrong ceremony. The Miss Harvest Ranch pageant isn't until next weekend. A polite chuckle rippled through the crowd. Audrey flipped her shiny blonde hair over her shoulder and settled back into her perfect posture. We're here to award the winner of the state's largest pumpkin contest. Yay, farmers! She put her hand in the air and shook it as if there were a pom-pom attached. Everyone clapped. Wynn leaned close. Bet you didn't know you were a farmer. Judd turned his head, and their faces were breathe the same air close. I was born with green thumbs. He held up both thumbs. Wyatt cleared his throat and lifted both eyebrows, silently asking what was going on between him and Wynn. Judd felt like an idiot and lowered his hands. He couldn't meet his cousin's probing eye because he didn't have an answer for him. Heck, he didn't have any idea what was going on inside himself. How was he going to explain it to someone else? There wasn't a name for the place where he and Wynn lived, except best friends, and everyone knew that. But something had shifted the other day in the corn maze when his arms had held her close and her hand brushed his neck. something deep inside of him, and he didn't know if friendship was enough, though it was all he could ever ask. She nudged him from behind, more like 2 left feet. Normally, he would have busted into some crazy dance move to prove her wrong, but he was suddenly shy in front of Wyatt, not wanting to give him the wrong impression. He lifted a shoulder in response and turned his attention back to the stage. Here to present this year's trophy is our reigning Miss Harvest Ranch, Jenny Smith. She held out her hand, and Jenny walked on the makeshift stage in a full gold sequin gown, nearly blinding those on the front row. We'd like to thank all those who participated in the pumpkin growing contest. There are many more opportunities to get involved with the festival and earn a ribbon or trophy. Check out our social media pages and the list of events posted at the entry gate. Jenny smiled, and her teeth competed with the dress for brightness. You don't have to be a resident to participate. Okay, can I get a drum roll, please? A moment of silence rolled over the crowd as it dawned on them that she expected them to provide the drum roll. The man next to Judd began slapping his thighs in a quick beat. The kids joined in, and soon the crowd was roaring with anticipation. Judd glanced at Wyatt. Their eyes met briefly, and a spark of competition ignited in his chest. He reached behind him for Wynn's hand. Her cool skin was like a balm to his nerves. He laced their fingers together, not caring who saw them or what happened. He needed her. Wynn Westbrook! Judd dropped his chin a fraction. Recovering quickly, he thrust his hand toward his cousin. Congratulations. Wyatt pumped his arm. Thanks, man. He climbed the steps, pulling Stephanie by the elbow. She grimaced the whole time. What's going on with those two? Wynn asked, leaning close so she could be heard over the applause. I don't know, he replied. Her hand went to his back, and she rubbed small, comforting circles. Does this mean we don't get a trophy? Asked Lainey. Her big blue eyes filled with water. He scooped her up, and Wynn's arms came around the both of them. Why did it have to feel so good? What this means, Princess, is that we are going to grow an even bigger and heavier pumpkin next year. He tickled her until she laughed. Come on, I owe Bertie a dirty Dr. Pepper. Wynn tugged them into movement. Judd turned to look back at the stage, just as Wyatt accepted his trophy. The man wasn't smiling, and neither was his wife. Wynn stopped and waited with him to catch up. I'm sorry you didn't win. You've been working for this for so long, it all feels unfair. I may not have won, but I still feel like I came out on top. He hooked his arm around her neck and rubbed the top of her head. She shoved him away. You're so grounded, mister. She smoothed out her hair. Here I am trying to be understanding and supportive, and you mess up my hard work. Do you think this happens naturally? Shut up. You're beautiful. Her hands froze, and she stared at him as if trying to decipher his innermost thoughts. He mentally kicked himself, praying that the truth of his words and the deep feelings behind them didn't show on his face. I mean, everyone can see it, right, guys? He asked Miles and Lainey. Mommy's pretty, replied Lainey. Wynn seemed to realize they had an audience because she tucked her hair behind her ear and put on her mommy face. Thank you, honey, that's so sweet. She kissed the top of Lainey's head. Uncle Jed said it first, you should kiss him. Ever the fair one, Miles was quick to point out inconsistencies. Judd jumped in to save himself. It's okay. Your mom can buy me a soda, and we'll call it even. Wynn nodded, grabbing onto his plan with vigor. Any flavor you want. The flavor he wanted wasn't on the menu at Poppin' Fizz. He'd settle for, I'll try a Maui Wowie. It's all the rage this year. All the rage, huh? She called him out on never using that phrase. Ever. The sarcastic Wynn he could handle. The sultry, sexy, pouty lips Wynn? Not so much. It's a real humdinger, I hear. He cupped his ear like an old man who'd forgotten to put in his hearing aids. We'd better shake a leg, then. She put her hand out and pretended to walk on shaky legs while using a cane. Miles and Lainey looked at them and then at each other. Grown-ups are weird, Miles told his baby sister. He took her hand and headed toward the food booths as if he were trying to get her out of the situation without being contaminated by their weirdness. Wynn cupped her mouth and whispered, It's too late for them. They have our genes. If only they knew what lurked inside of them. Judd wiggled his fingers like an evil mastermind. Shall we continue this weirdness over a fizzy drink? She put out her elbow for him to hook his arm through. I believe we shall. He linked elbows with her, and they were off. This was why he loved his life. He had a best friend to hang out with all the time, his niece and nephew to torment with his sense of humor, and he was never lonely. So why did he feel like something was missing? Chapter 9. Wynn. If Wynn had known what was in store for her over the next week, she would have bottled up the Saturday morning with Judd and the kids so she could sip from it later like a refreshing Maui Wowie from Poppin' Fizz. Sunday was church. The whole Westbrook clan showed up at one time or another. Usually, the country cousins were first in the door, unless there was a rodeo somewhere. Then they'd attend in another town. Most of them were already in their seats by the time Wynn and Judd struggled through the door with two whiny children who wanted nothing to do with acting pious and everything to do with climbing up and down the adults as if they were playground equipment. They filed into the row with her in-laws, though her mom-in-law was nowhere to be seen. Thanks for saving us seats. Wynn sat down too fast for the wooden bench. She grimaced as her backside protested. She glanced back at the cousins across from them. Where's Wyatt? She whispered to Judd. He shrugged. Sick? She pushed thoughts of the family drama they'd witnessed from her mind and glanced down her own row. It wasn't any of her business what went on in Wyatt's and Stephanie's marriage, and she had enough on her plate to occupy her thoughts. Of course, if there was anything she could do to help, she wanted to. Prayer. That was the way to go. Prayer and an open heart. Karen, Judd's mom, climbed past them, pausing to kiss her grandkids on the cheeks. You two grow every day. I'll give you a cookie if you promise to stop. The kids giggled. Karen moved on to take her seat by her husband. No offense, but your mom looks worn out, Wynn whispered to Judd over the top of Lainey's head. She's a grandma, Lainey said indignantly, and with enough volume that Grams knew they were talking about her, as did half of the church. Karen leaned forward, looking past her husband, Bertie, and Anders to see what was going on at this end of the pew. Wynn offered Karen a sheepish smile before mouthing the words, I'll tell you later. She leaned back and waited for her face to stop burning. Only then did she take in the back of the person in front of her and realize that the woman was a complete stranger. Oh joy, she would inflict her restless children on a newcomer. That was fabulous. Lainey got on her knees and leaned into Wynn's shoulder, getting right in her face. Mom, did you bring church snacks? Shh. Wynn worked to get her to sit back down. I have some mints in my purse. I'll get them. Wynn dove for her purse on the floor, grabbed the side, and lifted, spilling half the contents. The sound echoed around them. Let me help. Judd grabbed Miles and set him on his other side before reaching for the mint container. It shook like a maraca and added more embarrassment to her overflowing plate. By the time the meeting was over, Wynn was ready to grab her kids and run. But, like it always seemed to happen, fate was not on her side. The aisle clogged with people, and she was trapped as the stranger in front of her slowly stood and turned around. Her eyes took in Lainey hanging off her arm and Miles pushing Judd from behind. Her face suddenly softened. Well, aren't you the cutest little family? Taken aback, Wynn sputtered. We are... Don't be modest. You're adorable. I remember these days. It's so hard to keep them quiet. You two are doing a wonderful job. These kids are lucky to have you. Wynn glanced at Judd and saw his face go bright red, the same shade it turned when Stephanie had turned him down for homecoming in front of the whole school. Wynn had told him not to ask during the pep rally. "And you're so cute together, too, with all that blonde hair between you." She pointed back and forth between Wynn and Judd. "You're picture perfect. No wonder your children are so beautiful." Wynn opened her mouth to explain. "Actually, this is their nap time, I know, but they're really doing well." Wynn finally gave up. "Thanks, we really appreciate that." She patted Wynn's arm and then stepped into the flow of traffic. Wynn blew her hair off her face. "Can we go home yet?" Judd nodded. "Go, I'll be right behind you." As she plowed into the foot traffic, doing her best not to bump into people even though they stopped to chat with a friend they hadn't seen in a while or a neighbor they saw every day, she realized how much she and Judd did look like a family. She was the harried young mother, and Judd was the father who stood as her rock in the storms of daily life. Thatcher had never been that for her. Because of his illness, their focus was always on him and how to make him comfortable. She'd had to be Gibraltar, rising above the waves and storms that came their way. He was allowed to fall apart, but she was supposed to hold it together. She'd never found him lacking, and even looking back, she wouldn't change a thing. But having Judd, relying on him, being partners, it was beautiful in its own way. The only problem was that it wasn't real. Without a ring on her finger, either of them could walk away at any moment. A shiver of fear danced across her spine. What would she do if Judd left? If he fell in love? She'd be happy for him, of course. That was the only right answer. So why did the idea feel like a betrayal? Technically, he wasn't hers. But he was as much a part of their family as Lainey or Miles, and the idea of him leaving wrote a black mark on her heart.
"Wynn, are you coming?"
Judd held open the passenger side door for her. She'd made it through the crowd into the parking lot without seeing where she was going. Thank goodness she hadn't been driving. She blinked out of her deep thoughts as if shedding scales. They had plans to check in on her booth, where Brody was keeping an eye on things, and then take a picnic into the mountains. She needed to hurry because the sandwiches weren't going to make themselves. "Thanks," she said as she slid into the car and buckled her seatbelt. Judd nodded and grinned before closing the door and making his way around the vehicle. Her stomach flipped over, and she pressed her hand to her belly. They were a family, though not a traditional one. And that was okay. So what if people thought she and Judd were together? She didn't need anyone's approval or blessing. They weren't doing anything wrong. Besides, it wasn't like she wanted to get married again. Once was enough for her lifetime. His hand brushed hers as he rested it on the console between them. Her nerves spiked, making her jump.
"Sorry,"
he mumbled. "No, it's me. I'm all over the place today."
"Is something wrong?"
She turned to take in his handsome face, 2-day beard and deep blue eyes. He was here. "It's wonderful."
"Then let's get going."
He winked and put his hand on the back of her seat to back out. Wynn took a deep breath and willed her heart to calm.
Chapter 10. Judd. Judd made his way through the festival grounds to pick up Wynn. The kids were with his parents, and Anders had Wynn's car. It was due for an oil change, and he offered to get it done while she worked. Dad had the tools and the space behind the B&B for basic automotive care. A memory of lying on his back under a car while oil dripped all over him and Thatcher had him whistling a happy tune as he walked in. Thatcher wouldn't have wanted them to mope over him. He'd been all about living in the moment, and he tried to get his family to do the same. Judd should do more of it. He'd spent so much time worrying about his growing attraction to Wynn on Sunday that he hadn't been present during their picnic. The kids called him a spaceman, and he told them he was tired and needed a nap. He stopped at the butterbeer booth and grabbed 2 cups. Wynn had mentioned that she'd wanted to try it. Living in the moment, here we come, he thought, as he made his way to her corner of the craft section. The honey booth was a hive of activity, as usual, and shoppers spilled into Wynn's booth, exclaiming over her rustic and charming wares. She smiled warmly as she caught sight of him, and his chest warmed. Her blue eyes were a welcome sight after dealing with contractors all day. "Is that butterbeer?" she asked, intrigued. He handed her a cup that had a wand and a magical talking hat on the side. "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes danced. The $5 a pop was worth it to see her smile like that. She took a tentative sip and then sank into her seat with a look of pure satisfaction. "It's even better than I'd hoped." He took a drink, letting the flavors mellow over his tongue. "Not bad." "You'd like it more if you read the books." She got up and continued drinking as she looked over the booth to see if anyone needed her attention. "I fail to see how reading can improve my sense of taste." "Then you'll always be a muggle." She held up a finger and made her way over to a couple of gray-haired ladies admiring her table, the big one that would make this whole endeavor worth it, if it would just sell. "Can I help you?" Judd watched her answer questions. She was so at ease talking to strangers. She had a magnetism that drew them to her, an enthusiasm for what she did that was infectious. At the end of the conversation, one of the ladies bought a set of 3 crates. They twittered off, admiring their purchases and remarking about the selection this year. Evenings at the festival were always magical. Dusk settled in and lights came on, the kind he put up at Christmas with big bulbs and soft glows. The kids were tucked into their beds, leaving adults to wander through the booths hand in hand. Even the smell changed from cotton candy and sweets to flavorful meats and the deep, spicy scent of cinnamon. "I have another 5 minutes until I can close up." She checked her delicate silver watch. "No problem. I'll just muggle through." She rolled her eyes at the pun. "How was your day?" "Not bad. I got the Johansson job." He'd bid the job a month ago, not believing he had a shot at it. But the call came through that afternoon, and he'd waited hours so he could tell Wynn in person. The wait was worth it. Her eyes widened and her brows rose. She threw her arms around his neck. "Congratulations!" He hugged her back, drinking in her closeness. "Thanks." She stilled in his arms but didn't let go. The hug morphed from impulsively happy to comfortable, and then his heart started beating loudly in his ears. The sound blocked out the rest of the fair, the people, and the announcement over the loudspeakers. She smelled like pumpkins and chocolate, a strange combination, but one full of layers and layers of yum. She stepped back, but the feelings inside of him, the pulsing desire, didn't go away. It was an entity all of its own, pushing him to act. The pounding in his veins urged him to hold her close, to kiss her. He didn't want it to leave. She bit her lip and played with her hair. I need to put down the sides of the tent." He nodded, not trusting his voice. If he spoke, his deepest desires might pour out of him. Thinking grew more and more difficult as his pulse continued to pound in his ears. She pulled the white plastic sheet out from under the cash desk, and he moved to take one side and help her unfold it, hoping that focusing on a task would keep him from focusing on her and the way she glanced at him from lowered lashes. Securing his corner, he worked across the tent, wrapping the Velcro straps around the metal bars. He and Wynn met in the middle, both pausing and swallowing heavily. Wynn was out of breath, or maybe she was breathless with a need to be closer like he was. He reached for her side, powerless to walk away this time. Maybe it was the fairy lights and the romantic evening atmosphere that cast a spell over him. Or maybe it was the fact that he'd pushed these feelings down for too long and they needed a release. Or maybe she was just plain irresistible. She stepped closer. Her eyes searched his, and he dropped his gaze to her lips, brushing his thumb across her chin. She didn't move away,
but continued to study him as if she were seeing him for the first time. It could be that she was seeing him as a man for the first time, not as a brother or a best friend, but as a man full of desire for her. He leaned down and she lifted, and their mouths touched briefly. Time stopped. All he could hear was her quick breaths. They played like a soundtrack to the emotions coursing through him. Her bottom lip quivered, and she grabbed onto his arms, holding him close and pulling him closer. Her eyes sparkled with a need only he could answer. He dove into the next kiss, allowing his pent-up feelings to drive him. "We should stop." She cupped the back of his head and kept him from pulling away. "We should totally stop." He moved to kiss her jawline and then found her mouth again. She gasped, meeting him kiss for kiss. "I don't want to ruin our friendship." "Friends can kiss." "I've never kissed a friend like this before." She ran her hands through his hair and he sucked in air, feeling like he was drowning in joy. "There's a first time for everything." He kissed below her ear and she giggled. He made a mental note to come back to that spot and nuzzled her neck. "I don't want to regret this." He paused and pulled back, running his fingers down her cheek while pulling her body close. "Then don't. We're adults. We wanted to kiss. We can." "But what will people say?" He brushed the worry lines out of her forehead like he'd wanted to for weeks. The freedom to do so was intoxicating. "It's none of their business. This is you and me." He paused for a moment, barely thinking it through, but knowing she'd have one more concern because he shared it. "And we'll be cool in front of the kids." "You mean you want to sneak around with me?" She arched one eyebrow and gave him a pouty, totally sexy look. "Sneaky is my middle name." She ran her hand up his arm. "How did I not know that?" "There's all sorts of things you don't know about me." "I'd like to learn." Her eyes grew heavy with desire. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he splayed his hands over her back and drew her body flush with his. Kissing Wynn was the best feeling in the whole world. It was like finding out he could fly, and he never wanted to stop. Nothing inside of Wynn told her to stop kissing Judd. Nothing. Surely there was a part of her that thought this was a bad idea, but if it existed, it didn't speak up. His arms were strong, thick, and warm. As the night air grew chilly, she burrowed closer to him, deeper into his embrace, and he welcomed every inch she gave up between them. Her body flushed with tingles and thrills in all the right places as he ran his hands up her sides and across her back. It was like he knew exactly what she needed, how to make her feel strong and beautiful while holding her like she was breakable. Kissing him should have been strange, like kissing a brother or cousin. But it wasn't. It was the opposite, like kissing her Hollywood crush, eating the best piece of chocolate, and dropping into a bubble bath all in one. He smelled clean and manly and tasted like butterbeer, a flavor she liked more than she should. Her desire to be with him continued to grow until she felt like it would consume her. That was the moment she put her hand on his chest and pushed. He leaned back, his eyes lazy with and his cheeks flushed from making out. Dang it all, he was a hottie. It wasn't like she hadn't noticed before, but she'd never let herself go all the way there with him, always keeping a bubble around the thoughts that could cause her to do something she'd regret. Who knew that when the bubble popped, it would be this good? Holy cannoli, the man could kiss. It's getting late. She spoke to his chest, not sure she could bear to look him in the eye and see disappointment, or even worse, revulsion at what they'd just done. For her, it was beautiful, hot and sultry, yet amazing and sweet, with a hearty dash of innocent exploration. Like no other kiss before. Would any kiss ever compare? The sky was dark, and the tent was dark. The sounds outside the flimsy plastic fabric went quiet, and the corn maze's night lights glowed in the distance. He hooked his finger under her chin and lifted her gaze to meet his. Her heart pounded hard against her ribs. When their eyes met, all she saw was Judd, her best friend, her confidant, the man who took care of her when she was sick and ran the kids to school when they missed the bus.
"I propose."
She went rigid in his arms. Proposals? What on earth did he think had happened just now?
"Relax,"
he chuckled. She felt the sound against her palm and curled her fingers against his shirt.
"I propose that we don't freak out about this."
She smacked his arm. You could have picked a better way to say that. He laughed, and the tension that had coiled inside of her relaxed.
"You're the one freaking out. Your eyes are as big as the moon."
You're not supposed to tease someone after you kiss them. Did your mother teach you nothing?
I guarantee she didn't teach me about this.
He traced his finger across her cheek, leaving behind a trail of heat. Yeah, okay. She covered her face and rubbed her eyes. If we're not freaking out, what are we doing? He loosened his hold and grabbed her hands.
We're trying this out.
This?
Kissing. We're kissing friends.
Is that a thing?
It can be our thing. Look, we can make this a huge awkward deal, or we can go with it and see where we end up.
What if we end up hating each other?
That's not going to happen, because we won't let it happen.
She pulled her hand from his and cupped his cheek, enjoying his scruff against her palm. So I can do that and it's fine? He leaned into her touch.
Totally fine.
She stepped closer, bringing their bodies flush. And this?
He cleared his throat. Fine. All fine.
She grinned. Okay, then. He grinned and plopped a kiss on her lips. But we can't let the kids see us. I don't want them getting the wrong idea or spreading rumors at school or telling your family. That would be the worst-case scenario. How would she ever explain herself to her mother-in-law? There were no words that would make up for that kind of betrayal. His smile faltered, but he recovered quickly.
Yeah, undercover kissing is the best kind anyway.
She laughed. You're a regular James Bond. The spy who kissed me. He bobbed his head.
I like the sound of that.
She shoved his arm as she stepped away. All right, Mr. Bond. Let's get this tent shut up for the night so I can go to bed. I've got a busy day tomorrow.
Yes, ma'am.
He grabbed her around the waist and nuzzled his nose into her neck.
Have I ever told you you're cute when you're bossy?
Breathless with giggles, she shoved against his hold. I must be downright irresistible 90% of the time, then.
You have no idea.
He let her go and flipped around to double-check that the tent sides were velcroed tight. Wynn put her hand over her heart, trying to calm it down. Judd was just being Judd. He was always funny, always a tease. Her reaction was a result of having been kissed for the first time in years. That was all there was to it. No need to read anything more in there than what was plain as day. She rubbed her lips, enjoying the slightly swollen feel of them. Kissing was a good thing, a stress reliever. She glanced over her shoulder. She could do with a little more stress relief in her life.
Chapter 11. Judd. Judd whistled as he walked down Main Street. The Johansson job was well begun, and therefore half done, as his mom would say. He liked the way the interior had turned out. The owner left the beams exposed in the ceiling. Because of the steep-pitched Swiss roof, it would be a bugger to heat in the winter, but the aesthetic was worth it. He'd use piping to hide the wires. The owner wasn't happy about the increase in price, and he had to talk to him about it today. Get a check. This was the part of being the business owner he didn't enjoy. Asking people for money wasn't his forte, but not even that could dampen his mood. He'd kissed Wynn. Kissed her good. And it was amazing! So amazing! Better than anything he'd dreamed. Not just in a physical sense, because that was top-notch, but also in a cosmic connection way. He'd never been so in sync with a woman, so aware of her needs and filled with the desire to fulfill them. Reading her body language came easily, like he'd been doing it his whole life. A horn honked and he turned to see his cousin's truck crawling along beside him. "You lost?" Wyatt called through the open window. "Lost in thought." Judd stepped off the curb and up to the truck, resting his forearms on the door. Traffic was light this early on a weekday, and no one waited for Wyatt to move on down the street. "Where are you headed this morning?" "I just dropped Jaden off at school. Can I buy you a coffee?" The invitation from his favorite rival cousin was a surprise, but Judd wasn't one to hold a grudge, especially against his family. "It's the least you could do after you stole my trophy." Wyatt laughed, but the joy of winning didn't reach all the way to his eyes. Something covered him like a blanket, a shadow that wouldn't brush away with a new topic of conversation. "I'll park and be right in." Judd turned around to see he was in front of Choco Latte. Maybe while he was here, he'd get a few of those orange truffles for Wynn. "I'll see you inside." Judd stepped through the door, setting off the bell. The sound was like coming home. "Look what the chocolate brought in." Aunt Michelle grinned from behind the glass display case. "I haven't seen you in a while, sweetie. How are things?" A sense that all was right with the world filled Judd, and he lifted his chest. "Things are going great." He crossed the scuffed, though shiny, wood floor. One of these days they'd need to replace it, but Michelle always said that classics never went out of style. They just became well-loved. You could say that about the whole of Choco Latte. The outside resembled a small Swiss home, with local stone used as a wainscot and small windows framed by green shutters with tulips cut into them. The town settlers named the place Harvest Ranch because they fancied themselves American cowboys, but they scoffed at log cabins and built houses that made them feel like they were home. With a mountain full of stone, it wasn't hard to find building material. Some of the businesses covered up the look with sheetrock inside. Choco Latte was old school, with rough-hewn walls and thick support beams. The smell of fresh coffee brought in customers from 3 blocks away. Wyatt pushed through the door and glanced around for Judd. He smiled at Michelle. "Got anything that will kick my butt in gear this morning?" Michelle went to work, gathering a to-go cup and pouring some of her specialty brew. "Rough night?" Wyatt clamped his lips shut. That same look of despair that Judd had seen at the pumpkin judging returned. "You can say that." "Here, hun." She set the cup on the counter. "What about you?" Judd scratched his chin. "I've already had my coffee, but I'll take one of your pumpkin cocos." Her smile stretched across the room. "I'm so glad you like 'em. Sometimes I think things are going to work out, and they flop." She mixed and poured like a chemist, adding a dollop of whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar before putting on the to-go lid. "Not this one." Judd accepted his treat. "This one will be a keeper." "The tourists like it, I can tell you that." She winked and then looked over his shoulder as a customer came through the door. Wyatt dropped a bill on the counter and they headed for a table off to the right. The windows on the front of the building were small, but the ones on this side, which overlooked a small courtyard, were big and inviting. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping their drinks. Wyatt stewed like he had a burr in his boot, but he wasn't eager to share it. "What's on your mind?" Judd resisted checking his watch. If Wyatt was struggling at home, Judd didn't want to make him feel rushed to talk about it. Like any red-blooded man, he didn't think they needed to talk about it at all. Wyatt stared at the table. "I'm wondering what's going on with you and Wynn." Heaping piles of guilt appeared in Judd's view. No one could know what had happened last night. Unless, well, there was always the possibility that someone had seen or heard something despite the fact that they stood behind the tarp they'd hung. If there was one thing Judd knew about Wyatt, it was that he wouldn't reveal the ace up his sleeve this early in the conversation. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you guys are always together, you live next door, and I see your truck in her driveway more than in your own. He ran his hand down his face. Are you moving in on Thatcher's girl? What? No! Judd leaned back in his seat, as far away from Wyatt and his accusations as possible. Nothing like that. Those kids look at you like you're their daddy. They need someone. Wyatt shook his head. I don't know. It feels like you're breaking the bro code. Judd stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor and drawing attention from the customers now streaming in. Must be about 9 o'clock. He took a deep breath and consciously used a calm voice. I would never do anything to dishonor Thatcher's memory. Wyatt glared up at him. What about fall in love with his wife? Judd sputtered. I'm not in love with her. Wyatt was on his feet in a blink. It's so obvious to everyone but you. You stare at each other like lovesick puppies. Judd glared, tracing all the hard lines on Wyatt's face. You know what else is obvious to everyone? Your marriage is falling apart. You glare at each other like you can't stand to be in the same room. Wyatt picked his chair up 5 inches and slammed it back in place. Stay out of my marriage. Stay out of my life. Who are you to tell me I can't be there for Thatcher's kids, that Wynn has to do this alone? She doesn't. And as long as I'm breathing, she won't have to. The room was silent. The coffee maker gurgled to life, strangely loud in a now crowded space. Judd glanced around. Dozens of pairs of wide eyes stared at him. Michelle bustled around the corner. Boys, what is the matter with the two of you? She took them both by the back of the shirt and pushed them toward the door. This is a family establishment. If you have a problem, take it outside. Sorry, Michelle, they mumbled like scolded children standing before the teacher. Embarrassed beyond measure, Judd hung his head. Wyatt opened the door and the two of them stepped out. The door shut firmly behind them with the ringing of a bell. Judd rubbed the back of his neck. Wyatt kicked the building with his boot. That wasn't how I planned that to go. Oh? You mean you didn't want us to get kicked out of Aunt Michelle's shop? 'Cause that was epic. You know she's gonna call our moms. Wyatt chuckled. That's all I need. One more female breathing down my neck. Nothing like getting in trouble together to dissolve angst between two rivals. Truth is, things are rough at home. Judd clapped Wyatt on the shoulder. Is there anything I can do? No, I'm not even sure what's wrong. We just can't seem to talk without fighting. I keep thinking Jaden deserves better parents who can get along, you know? Yeah. He didn't know. Didn't understand the trouble Wyatt described. His heart went out to his cousin, though. I have no advice. He laughed at himself. Wyatt joined in a beat later. Look, I'm sorry about what I said in there. I saw you and Wynn and the kids at the pumpkin contest, and you all looked like such a happy little family. I kept thinking that it should be Thatcher. I know he's been gone a couple years, but I still look for him. I miss him, you know? Judd nodded. In the beginning, I thought that 100 times a day. I still think it sometimes. I guess I've accepted that he's not coming back. He won't show up tomorrow and step back into his family. Our family. Wyatt sighed heavily. I guess I'm still working on that. It hits you harder because you aren't in the thick of it every day. Maybe, and I have my own crap to deal with. We good? He stuck out his hand. Judd shook it. We're good. Good. No hard feelings about the pumpkin either? Oh, there's hard feelings there. He squeezed Wyatt's hand tighter. I'm coming for you next year. Wyatt squeezed back. I'm counting on it. They dropped hands and headed in different directions. Judd started to whistle, but the sound died out quickly. If Wyatt was offended at seeing him and Wynn together, what would the rest of the family think? Would they all throw fits, call him names? Or worse, go after Wynn? He couldn't let that happen. Not that they'd promised anything other than the chance to kiss each other every now and again. Though he wanted the nows to be often. Still, what would Anders think, or Bertie, or Mom and Dad? Was he doing something wrong by caring for Wynn? It didn't feel wrong. Ever. but he wasn't sure that made it right either. There were lines a man shouldn't cross. The trouble was, he didn't know if he'd already crossed it. And if he had, what was he going to do about it?
Chapter 12. Wynn. Wynn froze in place to check herself and stared at Bertie, who had a huge, self-satisfied smile on her face. "Where's the table?" She turned her attention to the empty space in the middle of the tent. 4 6x6 squares outlined on the rug were the only indication that her showpiece existed. "I sold it!" Bertie squealed and threw her arms out. "A cute family from New York wanted it. They backed up and loaded the whole thing within minutes of their credit card clearing." Wynn pressed her cold hands to her cheeks. "It's gone. I can't believe it's actually gone. Do you know what this means?" She gulped and pressed on without waiting for an answer. "It means I own a viable business. I turned a profit. I have to pay taxes on my income." She jogged in place. "Bertie, I'm a successful business owner." Bertie smacked Wynn's outstretched hand. "Yeah, you are." Wynn traced an indent with her toe, pride welling up inside of her. "I feel like I grew up today." Bertie laughed. "No, really." She'd set out to prove she could provide for her family, that she not only had dreams, but could chase them. "Have you told Judd?" Bertie shook her head. "Why should I?" "Don't. I want to be the one to tell him." "'Kay." Bertie lifted one shoulder in a nonchalant shrug. Wynn glanced at her phone. She couldn't wait for Judd to pick her up tonight. This kind of news was best to share in person, because celebrating in person was a lot more fun now that she could kiss him. Several hours passed. She and Bertie traded off talking to customers and selling knickknacks, decorations, and picture frames. Wynn talked with a new sense of importance. Oh, it would fade in a day or two, probably when one of the kids spilled a drink down her front or pitched a fit in the grocery store. But she wanted to ride the high for a little while. "Why are you so antsy?" Bertie asked. Wynn froze in place to check herself and stared at Bertie. "I'm not antsy. Why would you think that?" Bertie took the duster out of Wynn's hand. "Because you've been waving this around like a fairy godmother and haven't actually dusted anything." Wynn blushed. Being outside was part of the draw for the festival, but it also meant regular dusting to keep the booth clean and inviting. "It must be the fact that we sold the table." In truth, she hadn't been thinking about the table as much as she thought about sharing the joy with Judd. He'd been grumpy in his texts, saying he'd run into Wyatt that morning and the guy was in a mood. She wanted to turn his frown upside down, manually, if needed. Bertie was going to close down the booth and the two of them would be blessedly alone in his truck. Her heart fluttered at the possibilities. There were just so many of them between this spot and home. Heck, there were dozens of kissing nooks between here and the parking lot. She never paid that much attention to hidey holes, but now it was all she could think about. "You sold the table?" Judd's voice acted like jumper cables attached to her heart and set it racing. She turned around, smiling so big she might pull a muscle. "Judd!" His name came out like a tidal wave of relief. He was here. Being apart was so much harder now that she knew how good it was to be lip-smacking close. Their eyes met and held. The fair faded away, all except the scent of honey that always permeated the air thanks to the booth next door. Still, it was sweet and deep and all things scrumptious, like Judd. She calmed down and fired up all at once. "Technically I sold it, but who's keeping track?" Bertie waved her hand in front of Judd's face. "Are you that shocked someone bought it? Geez, have a little faith, man." "I have all the faith in the world in Wynn," he replied. Warmth spread from her belly to her chest and then down her arms until her palms grew slick. She tucked them into her back pockets and rocked on her heels, feeling shy for the first time in her life in front of Judd. Bertie rolled her eyes. "Whatever.
She flounced off, pulling her phone from her back pocket to check texts. Wynn ducked her head. "Are you ready to go?" Judd hooked a thumb over his shoulder. "I have a great parking spot if you need to get some things done."
Right now would be a good time to remember some of her old flirting moves, except she didn't have any. Do you want to grab a butterbeer on our way out? Maybe reminding him of the other night would be enough to spark some interest in his eye.
"I'm good, but we can stop if you want one."
Disappointed that she didn't get the reaction she was looking for, she sighed. "No, I'm ready to go." She grabbed her purse out from under a table and hooked it over her shoulder. "Good night," she called to Bertie. Bertie waved without taking her eyes off the screen. It would have annoyed Wynn, but the girl was aware enough that no customer would go ungreeted. And she was thankful not to have an audience. Girls picked up on things boys were oblivious to, like when someone was trying to flirt with them. Wynn bumped Judd with her hip. "Rough day?"
"No, today was fine."
What was up with Wyatt? Whatever happened had gotten under Judd's skin. Maybe it was Wyatt's confession that his marriage was in trouble. Despite their history, Judd wouldn't want his cousin to go through tough times, and certainly wouldn't want his marriage to fail.
"I haven't seen him."
Oh. She ran out of things to ask about, and she didn't want to poke the bear. He said he'd had a good day, but he was grumpy. Maybe what he needed was a little stress relief. Up ahead, there was an alley between two tents. On a whim, she pushed him into the alley and wrapped her arms around his neck. Judd stepped back and leaned away.
"What are you doing?"
Her initial reaction to his reaction was to jump back and pretend her dumb brain hadn't come up with this crazy plan. But she was knee-deep in it now, and he smelled like garlic and butter. "I'm going to kiss you until you lighten up." She reached up and planted one on his lips. He didn't respond. She tilted her head and buried her fingers in his hair, massaging gently. "This will go better if you participate." Judd moaned. He pushed her back. "You're killing me, woman." He didn't sound upset at all. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I'm trying to have self-control." "Why?" She twirled his hair and he shuddered. That was more like it.
"Because we're in public."
He glanced both ways down the alley. Something told her that wasn't the whole reason, but she could only handle what she could see. "No one's going to see us, and if they do, they won't know it's us."
"Why not?"
"Because if you put your lips on mine and I put my lips on yours, our faces are completely hidden." He gave her a bad boy smile, and her knees went weak.
"How can I argue with that logic?"
"You can't." Her eyes dropped shut, and this time he was the one who kissed her. And what a kiss it was! When they finally pulled apart, breathless, she gulped and asked, "Do you feel better now?"
"Yep."
His short reply made her laugh. When she looked into his face, she saw the gentle, open man she'd come to care for and rely on. No more worry lines were etched around his eyes. He leaned out and looked around before jumping out of the alley and acting like nothing had just happened. She didn't have the heart to tell him he had lipstick on his cheek. Let him find it later. It would be a nice reminder of this moment.
"So you're kind of tricky with that alley move back there."
He bumped her hip. "Oh, I got moves, big guy." She walked ahead of him, swinging her hips. He jogged to her side.
"How about more alleys? Any close by?"
She grabbed his hand and pulled him behind the entrance sign. The grass had been stomped down and the sign butted up against the fence, making an alcove. "How's this?"
I like it."
He kissed her.
"At this rate, we won't make it to the truck."
She giggled. That's the idea. He tickled her side and kissed her again. The move was natural, easy, and strange all at once. Strange because she was comfortable taking their relationship on this path. Not to mention how secure she felt. Sure, her side wasn't as firm as it had been before 2 kids, but she didn't care when Judd pinched her and felt the padding. With him, She was comfortable with who she was, and didn't need to pretend to be anything more or less. Wynn laughed with the freedom, letting go of years' worth of stress and mommying and starting a business and feeling undesirable, lost, and alone. For this moment, she was just a girl kissing a boy. It felt so good. Chapter 13. Wynn. "Mom!" Wynn jerked as Miles tugged on her arm. He'd stopped in front of Choco Latte. "We're here." "Oh, yeah, let's go in." She held fast to Lainey's hand but let Miles open the door for them. The place was packed with tourists who came for the festival and then wandered down Main Street to see the quaint businesses. Since she hadn't spent much time with the kids this week, she'd promised them a trip to the chocolate store and the park. The weather was nice. They could tromp around town in hoodies and hats and not get cold until the sunset. Then the air turned crisp, and she reached for her electric blanket. They joined the line, and Lainey held her finger while spinning in ballerina circles. Wynn tried to get them to focus so they didn't stand, undecided, at the counter when their turn arrived. "What do you guys think? Should we try the pumpkin cocoa or stick with our regular order?" "I want everything," Lainey grinned up at her. Wynn did a double take. "Wait a second, sweetie." She put her hands on both sides of Lainey's face and used her thumb to pull her bottom lip down, revealing a loose tooth. "Is your tooth wiggly?" Miles crowded in, eager to see the new development in their lives. Lainey pushed her tongue against her bottom teeth. "I don't feel it." The tooth sat at an angle just off enough that only a mother would notice. Wynn grinned. "Let me try to move it." Lainey clamped both hands over her mouth and shook her head. Wynn paused. "Why not?" "'Cause I don't want to lose it," she wailed loud enough for the people in front of them to stop and look. Wynn ignored the stares. "It's a baby tooth, sweetie. When it comes out, it means you're getting bigger." "Yeah, besides, another one will grow in." Miles was full of, "I've been through this" knowledge. Wynn refrained from rolling her eyes. Miles lost his first tooth in a tree-climbing accident. It had gone gray and then fallen out. But as a boy, he'd hardly noticed, and all the while he'd thought he was the toughest thing since Gorilla Glue. Lainey silently pleaded with Wynn. "If you don't want me to check it, I won't. We can look at it tonight when you brush your teeth, okay?" "Okay." Lainey shuffled her feet. Wynn stood up, her back groaning from having hunched over for so long. They stepped forward as another customer left the store with a smile and a bag of chocolates. Wynn pointed to the display case. "You two go up and see what they have, then come back and tell me what you decide, okay?" Lainey perked up. Really, who wouldn't when they had so many delicious choices laid out in front of them? Presley glanced up as the kids crowded the glass and waved. Wynn waved back. Aunt Michelle came from the back, carrying a tray of chocolate almond bark. She dropped it on the counter to break the bark into pieces and then began arranging them in the case. Wynn took a picture of the kids and sent it to Judd. "Are you up for some chocolate and park time?" she texted. They spent a lot of time together, but she couldn't seem to get enough of him lately. He didn't respond right away, and she tucked her phone in her back pocket so she could order. The person in front of her paid and then stepped aside. "Well," she asked the kids, "what do you want?" "I want..." Lainey's eyes traveled back to the display case. "Mermaid rocks." Presley, Michelle's daughter and the artist behind the chocolate, laughed. Mermaid rocks were Lainey's name for seafoam candies. "I love that she calls them that. We should change the sign." She slid the back door open and reached for a wax paper to fetch the treat. "Me too. I don't even know where she got it from." Wynn dug through her purse for a credit card. A hand touched her elbow, and she lifted her gaze to find the woman from church who had sat in front of them. "If it isn't my new favorite family! Running into you is just wonderful. I didn't catch your names on Sunday." There wasn't a white hair out of place on her head. They all laid smoothly in an onion shape around her long face. Upon hearing her voice, Wynn was transported back to the predicament of mistaken identity, or mistaken family, as it were. She shook herself. "I'm Wynn, and this is Lainey and Miles." The kids offered their hands to shake, and Wynn breathed a sigh of relief that they remembered some of the manners lessons she'd given. The woman introduced herself to them as Miss Kelly. Presley handed the mermaid rock to Lainey and looked at Wynn. "I'll have the pumpkin cocoa." "You've got it." Presley moved to the side to start the drink. "Where is that handsome husband of yours?" asked Miss Kelly. Presley let out a small gasp, probably thinking that Miss Kelly asked about Thatcher. Wynn's face heated as she searched for a way to explain the situation to Miss Kelly with Presley listening in. The whole thing was awkward at best. "Well, you see, we aren't exactly—" She glanced down to see Lainey sucking on the sea foam, her eyes wide enough to take in every word of this conversation. "Judd is my—" She didn't want to call him her brother-in-law, because he didn't feel like one anymore. He felt more like a boyfriend. Heaven help her, boyfriend was not a word she could use right now, especially in front of the kids and Judd's cousin, who, upon inspection, was listening with one ear while she mixed pumpkin spice. Miss Kelly's brow furrowed. She gulped. "We're best friends." Miss Kelly huffed like she thought that was the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. "Do you live?" Presley set a to-go cup on the counter between Wynn and Kelly, breaking up the conversation. "Sorry, but we need to keep the line moving. What about you, big guy? What would you like?" She directed her question to Miles, but winked at Wynn to let her know she had her back. Wynn nearly melted into a puddle of relief. She placed her hand on Miles's back and focused on him, as if she needed to in order to help him choose something. He knew the menu better than she did. Miss Kelly stepped back to let them finish their order. Miles asked for a piece of the bark Michelle had just stacked, and Presley weighed it, chatting the whole time so Miss Kelly didn't have a chance to jump back in. "Have you decided what you're going to be for Halloween? Spider-Man? Really? What about you, Lainey?" "I think you'll make a great pumpkin. You have the most adorable dimples, and pumpkins with dimples are the cutest." Wynn laid her card across the reader and tucked it back in her purse. She turned to Kelly. "I'm sorry we can't stay to chat. We have to meet someone at the park." "Of course. Have a wonderful day." Her smile was strained, probably because she had more curiosity than a black cat on Halloween. Wynn did her best to return the gesture, though her insides roiled with uncertainty. Setting Miss Kelly straight wouldn't have been so difficult if she knew where she and Judd stood. They were at an in-between place, a super fun spot with lots of benefits, but nothing defined. Her grin dropped the second she turned around. They were almost to the door, and to safety from prying churchwomen, when Aunt Michelle flagged her down. She was cleaning off the tables near the window and had a solemn look on her face. Wynn gulped. What now? "Hey, Michelle." She greeted the shop owner with a hug. Her kids did the same, but they were quiet, as if they knew their mom wanted out of there. Michelle stepped close and tipped her chin down as one does when they want the conversation to be private in a room full of people. "Listen, I don't know what's going on with you and—" Her eyes dropped to the two children listening in, and she amended whatever she'd been about to say. "Your neighbor, but I overheard him and Wyatt arguing over his feelings for you." "His feelings for me?" Wynn's throat constricted, and she ended up squeezing out the last word. "What feelings?" Michelle cocked her head as if Wynn were daft. "Honey, you can't miss the way he looks at you. We all see it." She glanced down again. "And the way he cares for your littles as if they were his." Wynn reached for Lainey's hand, needing to feel something solid. "I'm confused." "You really don't know?" Michelle lightly touched her shoulder, her eyes full of motherly knowledge and concern. "You really don't know the way you look at him? Heaven knows I couldn't marry any of Scott's brothers, but it works for you two." Wynn's head reeled and she stepped back. Marriage? How had she come in for a treat and ended up in this conversation? She wasn't getting married again, not ever. Her brain had one thought: retreat. "We really have to go, Michelle. Thanks for the drink and stuff. I'll see you later." Michelle tisked her tongue, but she didn't try to stop them as Wynn fled the scene. She didn't stop until she was at the corner and surrounded by strangers who wouldn't comment on her personal life, looks, or marriage. "We can cross." Miles took off for the other side of the intersection. She hurried after him, dragging Lainey along and finally picking her up and carrying her, because the little girl just didn't have the hustle her older brother had. "Miles, wait!" He paused and turned expectantly. "We should stick together." He didn't answer, but stayed by her side. "Mommy?" Lainey held up her chocolate-covered hand. "I'm sticky." Wynn sighed. "Yes, you are." She set her down and rummaged for a package of wipes as they walked. "Are you getting married?" asked Miles. Wynn's head whipped up. "No! Why?" "Because Aunt Michelle said—" Aunt Michelle was joking about marrying someone. She pulled the wipe out and handed it to Lainey. Then she grabbed another one because she would have to help her wipe her hands in about 2 minutes. But if she started out helping, then Lainey would be upset. The girl had some independence in her since starting first grade. Wynn was curious about how her kids would react to the idea of her bringing a man into their lives, even if she had no intention of tying the knot. Although, if she were to marry someone, Judd... Nope, she was not going to go there. It was just, he was already a part of the kids' lives, and they loved him as much as they loved her. Not to mention he was always there for her, and he was the person who made her laugh. And now she knew they had chemistry. Lots of chemistry. But what about the logistics? They had 2 houses. Where would they live? Her house. Really, it was the only reasonable option. The kids needed the stability. Judd shouldn't mind. He spent more time at her place than his anyway. After that was solved, there wasn't much else to figure out. He already picked the kids up from school if they were sick. They had dinner together all the time. He cooked in her kitchen. Oh my gosh, we're already practically married. Lainey shoved her gooey wipe into Wynn's hand and sprinted after her brother for the swings. They always started out there and then moved to the slides. Wynn sank onto a wooden bench where she could watch them, but think. Michelle was right. She was blind to what was going on right in front of her face. She and Judd co-parented on a daily basis. They texted all throughout the day about everything. He was the person she stayed up late with, confiding her fears that her booth would flop and she'd be forced to list her wares for cost on Craigslist. They were married in most ways, except the most important. She glanced down at her bare ring finger. Gulping down the pumpkin cocoa, she did her best to quell the rising tide of panic in her chest. Thatcher's family thought of her as an angel, the woman who had loved a man who was going to die. But the more time went on, the more she realized that she'd been young and naive when she'd said, "I do." She'd had no idea what a marriage was supposed to look like, that it would be empty and lonely at times. She'd never considered leaving him. That just wasn't an option because she really did love him. But it wasn't the kind of love that would have passed the test of time. In the end, she wasn't even in love with him anymore. She'd cared for him like a mother, taking care of his physical needs and holding him when the pain was too much. And through it all, she'd given up parts of herself. She didn't sing in the shower for fear of waking him up. She didn't dance in the kitchen because the emotional load she carried was too heavy. She didn't read the book she wanted to because he wanted her to read his books out loud to him. And it was all fine. She was happy to be the angel in his life. But a while after he was gone, she realized how much of herself she'd poured into him and how little she had left. Not that Thatcher meant to drain her, he just needed so much of her. She didn't want that to happen ever again. She was just starting to find her happiness, and if she tied herself to a man, he could take it. A heavy, warm hand landed on her shoulder, and she twisted up to see Judd smiling down at her. Her whole body buzzed with awareness. "Hey," was all she could muster from her overloaded brain. Part of her knew that Judd and Thatcher were two different people, but she'd watched her alcoholic father drain her mother's soul, and knew that there were many ways a woman could lose herself in a marriage. He licked his lips. "Is that pumpkin cocoa?" He reached for her cup, and she was too aware of his chest brushing her shoulder as he leaned down to take the cup and the scent of his cologne to stop him from taking it from her. He took a sip, his eyes sliding shut with pleasure. Something took hold of Wynn's heart. It was warm, full of gratitude and thanksgiving, and it wrapped 1,000 silk ribbons around her and Judd, as if her soul had just tied itself to his and she could see the ties. They weren't restrictive. They were beautiful, because they weren't tied by vows, but by friendship, understanding, and laughter. Wynn wrapped her hand around his, drawing his attention. "What?" he asked, bemused by her seriousness. "I've never said thank you." Tears stung, and she had to swallow back the rush of emotion. You're here for the kids, for me. It's so much to ask, but I haven't ever said—" He cut her off with a finger on her lips. "You don't have to." "But I want to," she mumbled against him. He chuckled. Looking around, he quickly leaned down and stole a kiss. "You're welcome." He winked and then sauntered off to talk to the kids, taking her drink with him. She grinned, swiping at the tears and laughing at her emotional flood. If he knew half of the thoughts she'd had that day, he would have a fit. Judd didn't take things seriously, not like she did. He was an in-the-moment kind of guy and unlikely to think about tuxedos, flowers, and engagement rings. Marriage. Pfft. She gave herself a mental shake and pushed to her feet. Analyzing and obsessing over what Michelle or Miss Kelly or anyone else thought was only inviting trouble. Things were good, and she should go with the flow rather than try to see downriver. As she jogged over to push Lainey on the swings, she tried to shake the sense that there was a bend up ahead, and she was unprepared for what awaited her. Chapter 14. Judd. "You can't sleep in your costume, sweetie. It'll get ruined." Judd pulled the popcorn from the microwave and opened the steaming bag. Bertie was closing up the booth tonight, but Wynn needed to make an early deposit, so Judd had brought the kids home. They had more cash on hand than she was comfortable leaving with just Bertie after Billy Cunningham, a security guard at the festival, canvassed the craft booths asking about a stolen $500,000 engagement ring. The ring had gone missing on a horseback riding adventure on the edge of town, but Billy wasn't leaving any stone or pumpkin unturned. The mayor upped the night security for the coming week as a precaution. "But I want to be a pumpkin!" Lainey threw herself on the floor and went limp. She wasn't the type to kick and scream. She'd just as easily give the whole world the silent treatment. Judd rolled his eyes at her dramatics. "You can pick. You can be a pumpkin tonight and then not wear your costume to school, or you can save it for school and dress up like all your friends and show your teacher." She sighed as if he were the bane of her existence. Since when had she turned 17? Kindergarten was a bad influence on this girl. He stepped over her to get to the living room where Miles waited patiently on the couch, scrolling through Disney Plus to find them a show. Lainey rolled onto her stomach and crawled down that hallway to her room. Miles gave him a girls look and then went back to scrolling. Judd stifled a laugh. The kids were on a roll tonight. He checked his watch. The trick to a successful movie night was finding a film that both Lainey and Miles liked. Miles could handle a princess movie every couple of weeks, as long as no one sang along. Lainey would put up with superheroes unless she was tired. Heaven help him if they were both tired, because compromising was impossible. "Your mom should be here any minute." As if on cue, headlights flashed through the window as Wynn pulled in the driveway. His pulse kicked up, and he checked his shirt to make sure the buttons were done and he didn't have any food on himself. He ran his hand down his mouth and chin for good measure. He liked the way Wynn giggled when he rubbed his facial hair against her jaw, so he'd skipped shaving again today. She came through the door, and he was on his feet without realizing how he'd gotten there.
Jeez!
Miles held the bowl of popcorn by the lip, barely keeping it from falling on the floor. Sorry, bud. Judd turned to save the popcorn and then whipped around to smile sheepishly at Wynn. Had she noticed the way he stumbled over himself to get to her? Now that they were face to face, he didn't know what to do with Miles in the room. Wynn grinned as if she knew his dilemma. She quirked a sexy eyebrow at him and lifted a shoulder. He groaned. As much as he wanted to take her in his arms, he'd have to wait until the kids were asleep. Life would be so much easier if he could just kiss the woman. He liked their new arrangement, but it wasn't without its drawbacks. Lainey walked in, wearing her pajamas and a pair of moon boots.
I'm ready to watch the movie.
As Lainey climbed onto the couch, Wynn pointed at the boots and mouthed, "Why?" "She gets it from you," he said out loud. "What, her stunning fashion sense?" "No, her stubbornness." Wynn lifted her chin. "I'm afraid that's a Westbrook trait. My family has never been known for being stubborn." He poked her ribs, and she did her best not to laugh. They settled on the couch with Lainey between them and Miles on his right. He threw his hand over the back cushion and began to knead Wynn's neck. Lainey sat still for a moment and then crawled onto Wynn's lap. Wynn shifted so she was closer to him, practically within his arm. The show about a lost dog unfolded on screen. He looked down at Miles to find his eyes starting to droop. Lainey was right behind him. Judd's fingers tingled with anticipation, and he rubbed Wynn's shoulder. She leaned into him, bringing her vanilla and honey scent with her. He breathed her in, feeling like this was exactly where he was supposed to be. They watched for a few more minutes, neither of them daring to make eye contact. It was a strange and wonderful feeling, knowing he would burst with desire and not be able to stop himself from kissing her if he so much as turned his head. It was like a line in the sand, and if he crossed it, there was no going back. He didn't want to wait, but he knew the rules. No kissing in front of the kids. It was the only rule they had, and he couldn't be the one to break it. When he thought he would explode, Wynn pushed herself up with Lainey in her arms. "I'm going to tuck her in. Why don't you take him?" He found Miles asleep on the arm of the sofa. He hadn't noticed him drifting off because all he could think about was Wynn and the soft curve of her cheek. He scooped up the boy and took him to his room, where he tucked him in and gave him a kiss goodnight. Miles didn't even bat an eyelash. Judd slipped into the hallway and ran to the front room. Wynn was waiting there, standing in front of the television. She lifted her arms and surged at him. He met her halfway and kissed her like a man drowning with need. She returned his fervor, running her hands through his hair and down his neck. He picked her up and was carrying her to the couch when the front door opened. "I saw the lights on." Birdie stopped mid-sentence and screamed. Judd set Wynn down and dropped his hands. "Birdie, don't you know how to knock?" "I never have to knock here." She covered her eyes like she was shielding them from the sun. Judd looked to Wynn for help. Wynn swallowed. How much did you see?" Birdie's eyes squeezed shut. "More than I can erase. You two, how long has this been going on?" She motioned her hand back and forth between them, her eyes squeezed shut. "Never mind, I don't want to know. Gross." Judd huffed and folded his arms. "Hey, we're not that old." He looked to Wynn for confirmation. "Well, you're older than me, so..." She winked. He growled. Birdie flapped her hands. "Stop! Old people should not flirt. Here." Birdie held out a set of keys and jangled them in the air, still not making eye contact with him or Wynn. Wynn took them. "Does this really bother you?" Her voice was soft, non-threatening. Bertie moved her gaze to Wynn's bare feet. I mean, yeah, I guess. I just never thought of you two like... She flapped her hands again. Please don't tell anyone. Judd's heart cracked at Wynn's pleading tone. Why not? Both women turned to him, their jaws hanging open. We talked about this. We agreed it would be just between us. Wynn gave him a hard stare. I don't remember why we did that. Because it's not right? Bertie filled in. I mean, she was married to Thatcher. Right, and I totally honor that. But he's not here, and I am. He poked his chest. Wynn's mouth fell open another half-inch. He'd never expressed so much as a centimeter of possessiveness toward her or the kids. He'd never felt a need to, never had to plant a flag in the yard and call this home. But he wanted it. He wanted the late nights and Christmas mornings with kids jumping on the bed. He wanted to hold Wynn whenever and in front of whomever he wanted. The stricken look on Bertie's face told him he'd pushed too far. He dared not look at Wynn for fear she'd be just as appalled as his sister. He might be ready to lay hold of the perfect family, but his family wasn't ready for someone else to step into Thatcher's place. Wynn might not be there either. Grabbing his jacket off the hook by the door, he stormed out without saying goodbye and walked across the lawn to his dark and empty house. Chapter 15. Wynn. Wynn pulled apart Velcro straps to open the booth, but her mind wasn't at the craft fair, nor was it on the crisp air that bit at her cheeks. It was stuck in the perfect moment when she and Judd had crashed together in a swirl of wanting, need, release, and more. The more was what had her stuck. And then there was the situation with Bertie. Granted, the girl was in high school and prone to dramatization, but her reaction gave Wynn pause. She'd worried about her children and how they would respond to seeing their mom kiss their uncle, but she didn't think much beyond that. Aunt Michelle had, though, which made her wonder how many more family members thought along the same lines, that she and Judd were eventually going to get married. Married? Sure, she was young, and most widows probably planned on being married again at some point. She just didn't want to. There were the kids, they kept her busy, and now the business. She had plans for next year, big plans. All this was getting in her head. She'd packed up supplies for today and left half of them on her porch. She needed to pull herself together, but each time she tried, all she could see was Judd storming away. Things between them were good, or so she'd thought. Kissing was great. Why did he have to act like it wasn't enough? Hey. She flipped around to find Judd standing just outside her tent, his hands stuffed in his pockets and his hair wet from the shower. Hey. She tucked a loose piece of hair behind her ear. Sorry about last night. He ducked his head. Bertie overreacted. She let out a breath. She's not the only one. Yeah, I know. Wynn sagged. I wasn't talking about you. Wait, what? He stepped forward, reaching for her. She moved toward him, and he touched her arm instead of pulling her close. Are you having second thoughts about us? This... She put her hand over his, halting his mumbling. You can't even say the word. I can say it. She cocked her hip. Then say it. He rubbed his lips together, swallowed, and then lowered his chin as he said, Snogging. She snorted a laugh at how ridiculous he was, a big, strong, grown man, for not being able to admit they'd been kissing. Following right on the first burst of giggles was a river of laughter. She held her side and let it flow. His bad boy smile appeared and he laughed too. His shoulders relaxed and his back curved slightly as he stepped closer. His eyes traced her lips and she tingled all over. Are we good? He asked. She nodded. Yeah. Because this whole thing was crazy. Getting caught kissing like teenagers by his little sister. And just because everyone else jumped onto the marriage train didn't mean she and Judd had to buy tickets. She grinned. Birdie's probably traumatized for life, though. He scowled. If I ever catch her with a guy like that, she'd better pray he can run faster than me. Wynn shoved him playfully. You're such a hypocrite. Hey, it's a big brother's prerogative. Morning, you two. Dorothy sashayed into the booth, taking stock of what was left and then eyeing up the two of them. She'd stopped in periodically to rearrange things, but they were both so busy that they didn't have time to properly chat. Wynn was hyper-aware of Judd's hand on her arm and how close they stood, and what it probably looked like was going on between them. Because it was going on. I have to get to work. I'll let you two talk shop. He squeezed Wynn's arm before nodding to Dorothy and walking off. Wynn forced herself not to watch him go. The conversation she hadn't had with Dorothy hung over her like a gilt shawl. She drew herself up and began the morning routine, firing up the register and plugging in the lights. She'd only need them for a while. The warm glow was inviting. You sold the table! Dorothy clapped her hands. I knew someone would buy it. It was such a great piece. Thanks, I'm thrilled. She continued to work, unpacking string pumpkins and candlesticks for display. Selling the table had been her biggest hope and stress, and since kissing Judd, she'd hardly thought about it. He'd taken up more of her mental space than ever, which was saying something because he was in every part of her life. Dorothy glanced over her shoulder. You know, I never would have asked you to set me up with Judd if I'd known you were in love with him. Wynn dropped a candlestick. The shaft cracked as it hit the ground. She gasped and squatted to pick it up. This particular piece was a favorite. She'd spent hours with the Dremel getting it just right. I'm not in love with him. She spoke to the ground as she gathered up the pieces. They'd kissed. Why was it so hard for people to differentiate between a kiss and a lifetime commitment? Wait, Dorothy didn't know they were locking lips on a regular basis. Unless Birdie was a bigger gossip than Millie Douglas and had told half of Harvest Ranch about last night. That would be a stretch even for Millie's mad skills. Dorothy frowned. I'm not trying to pry. I just wanted you to know I wasn't trying to move in on your territory. Wynn stood up and tossed the broken candlestick into the garbage can. He's not my territory. What is with this town? Judd and I are friends. That's all we're ever going to be. I've had my marriage, and I'm not looking for another one. Dorothy's eyes jumped over her shoulder, and Wynn turned to find Judd with a box in his hands, the box she'd packed and accidentally left on her front porch this morning. His cheeks were red, and his eyes were stricken. I saw this on your porch and thought you might want it. He set the box down and turned away. Wynn bit her cheek to keep from calling after him. She glanced at Dorothy. Do you think he heard me? Dorothy nodded, biting her bottom lip. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Wynn held up a hand. It's me. Tears burned her eyes. I shouldn't have said all that. The truth is, I have no idea what I feel lately. She sniffed. Case in point, I don't cry. Haven't for a long time, but I'm leaking all over. She used her hoodie sleeve to wipe the moisture off her cheeks. Dorothy pulled a tissue out of her purse and handed it over. Thanks. Wynn wiped under her eyes. People keep telling me I'm in love with him, and I just don't know. I've been in love before, and this is nothing like that. Dorothy was quiet for a moment, like she had something to say, but debated if it was a good idea to stick her finger in the pudding. It wouldn't be, would it? Wynn shook her head. I don't understand. Dorothy leaned against a table. Every person is different, and love is the product of the chemistry between them, so there are infinite possibilities for love throughout the world. I guess. Yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way before. Wynn settled herself next to Dorothy. She watched booth owners bustle about with their opening tasks. In a few days, all this would be over, and she'd be back to real life. Was it possible that love was never the same? I wish I had a pumpkin cocoa right now. Aren't they delish? I had one the other night. I hope Chocolate keeps making them after the festival is over. Michelle will keep it on the menu until it's time to switch to Christmas cocoa. Wynn rolled up the tissue and stuffed it in her pocket. She sighed. A small line appeared between Dorothy's eyebrows. I had a thought, but it sounds kind of mean, so I probably shouldn't say it. You helped me set up the booth, without pay. You earned the right to speak your mind, and I'd love an honest opinion right now. Dorothy paused, glancing up as if weighing her words. I just think, well, Judd's a great guy, and he's all tied up in you and your kids, and that sort of makes him unavailable. So? So, is it really fair to him? I mean, how's he ever going to have a family of his own if he's busy raising yours? Wynn dropped her face in her hands. He would be such a great father, or even stepdad. He loves my children like they're his own, and he could do that for some other kids out there who need a good male influence in their lives. Her mouth soured at the thought of him with someone else. But what was she going to do? Lock him away, figuratively, of course, until Lainey graduated high school? He'd be too old to start over. She wasn't even sure she'd be able to let him go then. Because she wanted him. Not just the guy who told bedtime stories, but him. The man with strong hands and a tender heart. The guy who saw a box on her porch and drove all the way into town to make sure she had it. He deserved a woman who would marry him. And she just couldn't. She'd loved Thatcher, but deep down, she hadn't loved being married to him. Maybe his health and imminent passing had been too much for an 18-year-old to take on. But even with the good times factored in, she hadn't liked being married because she lost herself in the process. She was such a horrible person to even think that. There was no way she could expose her darkest thoughts to Judd or anyone else. They'd think she was a monster. The whole family had sung her praises from the first day she'd become a Westwood. It made her feel like she was better than her no-good father and the stink he'd left on this town. And a woman needs a good man. Dorothy bumped shoulders with her. Not that I'm going after the position. I've sort of been dating someone. That's great. Wynn offered a watery smile. Anyone I know? Nope. We're planning to go to the Halloween parade together, so maybe we'll bump into you. Yeah, I'll be there with the kids. She bit off adding, and Judd, which normally accompanied a statement like that. They always went to the parade together, but maybe they shouldn't. Dorothy had a really good point. Keeping Judd from finding someone else not only wasn't fair to him, it was selfish. She'd been unselfish for so long. Was it really that bad to enjoy this time with him? Even as she asked herself the question, she knew the answer. She just wasn't ready to look at it yet. Dorothy pushed off the table and dusted off her hands. Listen, I have to get over to the big barn and set up for bingo. Centerpieces aren't going to make themselves. Centerpieces? Wynn desperately pushed away her thoughts and grasped onto the conversation. Yeah, I have 1,000,000 tiny pumpkins. I want to tie ribbons and twine around the stems and set them out. Bingo night is a big draw, and I wanted to add something new. I like it. My in-laws will be there. They never miss. Come on over if you can. Maybe I will, Wynn agreed, even though she knew she wouldn't make it. She'd promised Bertie the next 2 nights off if she didn't tell her parents about what she'd seen last night. It meant Wynn would work all day, and she'd need Judd to take the kids, but she didn't think he'd mind. She really needed to talk to him. I'll see you around, Dorothy waved as she walked away. Wynn dropped her head back. Customers milled past her tent, peering in but not stopping. She hadn't taken down the wall between her and the honey girls, and there were boxes strewn about that needed unloading. She set to work, getting everything in place and putting off the conversation she needed to have with Judd. She didn't want to end their kissing arrangement. It was fun and made her feel alive and free and even giddy. But she couldn't justify continuing on this path when it was a dead end. Once she didn't have an excuse not to call, she dialed his number, holding her breath. He answered on the 4th ring. "What's up?" His goofy greeting brought tears to her eyes, because she realized in that moment that no matter what promises they'd made about kissing not ruining their friendship, it was going to change. She sniffed and pulled herself together. He had no idea what she was about to throw at him. "Listen, I know I said I was okay with—" She turned her body away from the opening. "Kissing and all that, but I'm not." Silence. "I think we should go back to the way things were before." Yeah, like that was possible. He covered the mic. She imagined him throwing colorful words around. She didn't blame him. She had a few she wanted to toss out as well. This sucked. "I shouldn't have put you in this position. I'm so sorry, Judd." Tears spilled over in record time. Her heart ached and tore and fell to the floor like Lainey having one of her meltdowns. The organ just didn't know how it was going to go on beating after this horrible turn of events. "Don't worry about the kids. I'll get Anders to watch them or something. You should hang out with friends, enjoy the festival and stuff. I'm sorry we've taken up so much of your time."
"Whoa! What are you saying? You can't take the kids away from me."
She bit her knuckle and breathed deeply to maintain a semblance of control. "I'm trying to give you your life back. Before everything happened."
"I don't want that life. I hate that life. I want you and the kids and movie nights and getting caught making out and all of it. Wynn, I want to marry you."
She pressed her hand over her mouth to cover her sob. "I can't give you what you want." She closed her eyes, tears falling. "I can't. I gave everything to being married and I don't have anything left. I'm sorry," she whispered before hitting the end button. The red circle remained on the screen for a moment, like a punctuation mark telling her that this was the end of her time with Judd. She crossed her arms over her chest to hold herself together. "Excuse me?" asked a customer. Wynn swiped her hands over her cheeks and pasted on a smile. "Yes." The woman paused, taking in her red-rimmed eyes and probably messed up makeup. She smiled softly. "I was just wondering about the string pumpkins. Did you make those?" "I did." Wynn's voice grew stronger as she explained the process of soaking the string in sugar water and wrapping it around 2 small balloons taped together to get the right shape. She could do this. She could sell crafts and pretend that nothing was wrong. "Are you all right, dear?" "Allergies." She sniffed and excused herself to find a tissue. Her whole body shook. Her heart was tearing in two, and the very fabric of her family unraveled around her. She glanced at her phone, considering calling Judd and begging him to forget what she'd said. An internal battle raged. What was best for her might not be best for Judd. She had to let him go. He deserved to create his own family, to father children, and know the joy of holding a newborn in his arms. He deserved to be called Dad. And he deserved to be loved for a lifetime, married to the woman of his dreams. She couldn't give him what he deserved, so she'd step aside and let someone take her place. Even if it killed her. Which, if her heart continued to wilt, it would.
Chapter 16. Judd.
"What are you doing here?" Karen bustled around the kitchen island and gave Judd a welcome-home hug. It didn't matter that he lived only a few doors down and saw her several times a week. When he walked through the back door of the B&B, his mom considered him home. "The Halloween party starts in 10 minutes. You'll miss the kids." He pulled out a bar stool.
"I'm not going this year."
He traced the edge of the counter.
"Or maybe ever again."
"What on earth?" Karen pulled open the oven and removed 4 loaves. Pumpkin bread was a tradition at the B&B on Halloween. They were full to the rafters with the Harvest Festival, and several guests came every year. They'd expect the special treat when they came back this evening. If he knew his mom, she had a candy bowl waiting by the front door, too. Judd pressed the button to release the beaters and licked the cream cheese frosting off a tongue. I messed up with Wynn, and now she doesn't want me anywhere near her or the kids. I don't believe that for a minute. You two are peas in a pod. Karen handed him the other beater before running a knife around the edge of the pans. Not anymore. Even cream cheese frosting couldn't sweeten the taste of disappointment and loss he had to force down his throat. What did you do that was so horrible? He covered his face with one hand and leaned on his elbow. I kissed her. He couldn't even look at his mom. There were some things that a guy just didn't talk about, especially with his mother. But he had to get it out there, because she'd hear about it somewhere. She kissed you back, Bertie said from the doorway. Speaking of hearing it somewhere, Bertie, he snapped, dropping his hand and glaring at his sister. What? It's true. She was totally into that Mac session. Karen gave Bertie a look that said, watch it. Bertie shrugged with all the attitude of a 17-year-old on the cusp of spreading her wings. It's true. She practically climbed up him like a cat on a tree. Judd cringed at the mental image, though it wasn't far off. She'd wrapped around him and held on. He closed his eyes. Bertie, I swear, if I ever hear of you... Please. She cut her hand through the air. There are no guys worth kissing at my school. He sagged with relief for only a brief second. There were other high schools within driving distance. Karen wiped her fingers on her apron. The two of you, I can't even. She threw up her hands. Judd exchanged a smirk with Bertie. They might argue, but they were always on the same team when it came to their parents. Not that they were bad kids. They just liked to tease. Bertie grabbed a soda from the fridge and sat next to him. So, are you asking Mom's permission to marry Wynn? He scoffed. Hardly. I'm licking my wounds. Karen dumped a slightly cooled loaf onto the breadboard and then righted it. Bertie gave him a quizzical look. There wasn't a soft way to give bad news. Wynn dumped me. What? Bertie choked on her soda. Judd pounded her on the back and she sucked in a loud, wheezing breath. Why? She says she wants me to be free to live my life and not be tied down to her and the kids. Karen slammed the tin bread pan on the counter. And you believed her? He looked back and forth between the two women's scornful faces. Well, I did, until you both looked at me like I shouldn't have. Bertie pressed a finger to her temple as if she was trying to keep herself calm. How long ago was this? Judd glanced down at his shirt, the one he'd worn for the past 2 days and nights. Mom, help him. Bertie tipped her head and threw back a gulp of soda like a cowboy in a spaghetti western. Karen did that thing with her face where she arranged her features so that her true emotions were hidden. With lots of sons who had admittedly done stupid things as teenagers, she had practice. Honey, Wynn loves you, and it's no secret that you love her. In fact, you've probably loved her longer than you even know. He clamped his mouth shut like a suspect in an interrogation room. When a woman loves a man and she's not ready to commit, she'll find an excuse to set him free. Bertie nodded. I did the same thing with CJ. The punk who drives for FedEx? He was a senior and talking about life after high school and marriage and all these big things. And I was just a sophomore and wanted to go to prom and football games. And I wasn't ready to promise him more than the rest of the school year. So I made up an excuse and broke his heart. Karen patted her hand. It was the right thing for both of you, though you could have been kinder. Bertie flipped the tab on her can. Maybe. Judd blocked Bertie's wisdom. Wynn isn't in high school. Heck, we're practically a family already. And I told her I wanted all of it. The kids, her, family life. I'm not looking for a fling. How long have you two been making out? Asked Bertie. He gave her a hard look. Karen jumped in. It's an important question. He shrugged. I don't know, 2 weeks maybe? And you jumped from Matt to getting married? Bertie slapped her palm to her forehead. No wonder she ran scared. Geez, bro, desperate much? He stood up and began to pace. Mom rose to her full height, with no regard to how it makes her feel to be rushed. He leaned on the counter, letting the granite cool his hot palms. You've been thinking about yourself this whole time. Bertie's accusation was barbed. Karen turned on her. That's not fair. Judd's wholly unselfish when it comes to taking care of the kids and Wynn. He's given countless hours to their well-being without a thought as to what he gets out of it. Yeah. Judd bobbed his head. Until now. Huh? He whipped his head around to look at his mom. I thought you were on my side. I am always and will forever be on my grandchildren's side. Karen grinned. And the best thing for those kids is for you and Wynn to be together. Her eyes filled with tears. I think Thatcher would agree. He paused. In all this, he'd avoided thinking about his brother. He just couldn't face the idea that he was letting Thatcher down. Do you really think so? Liquid leaked out of the corner of his eye and he shoved it away. I couldn't. Maybe this was why he couldn't date Wynn like a normal guy. Why he felt like he had to jump over all the traditional date nights, because courting his brother's woman was unthinkable. Oh, honey. Karen was around the corner and holding him like he'd skinned his knee in a blink. Of course he'd want it to be you. Bertie threw her arms around both of them, crying outright. You stupid jerk. It has to be you. No other guy would be good enough in Thatcher's eyes. He laughed through the emotion he was doing his best to keep a lid on. You two are way too emotional. They laughed and both smacked his arm. He swiped under his eyes. I gotta get her back. Karen wiped her apron across her cheeks. If you don't, we'll kick you out of the family and keep her and the kids. Bertie offered Karen knuckles. Truth. But go slow, for the love. Do not under any circumstances use the M word. Karen nodded. Take it slow. Find out what she's feeling. Ask her to go for a hot cocoa. Take the kids if it makes her feel better. She laughed. It's always about the grandkids. She grinned. You'll understand one day. Now get out of here. She shoved him toward the door. And don't come back without your family. He paused long enough to peck a kiss on her cheek. I won't. Pointing at Bertie, he warned, Stay away from boys. She stuck her tongue out at him. He laughed, feeling lighter than he had when he'd arrived. He was going to get his family back, and he was going to love Wynn until she was ready to love him back. Chapter 17. Wynn. The Halloween costume parade was organized chaos at best. Everyone in town knew their roles, from the youngest ghoul to the oldest goblin. Parents dropped their kids off at the top of Main Street. They found their group of friends or stuck together as siblings, depending on the instructions they were given. When the spooky music started, they began their slow march toward the big barn. Parents lined the street, waving at familiar faces and acting scared as boys bared their werewolf or vampire teeth. They took pictures of their princesses and baseball players to post on social media. After the parade, everyone gathered in the big barn for games, dinner, and dancing. The spectators dressed up as well. Some people went all out in themed costumes. Wynn waved as the Incredibles family passed. She laughed with everyone around her as a child yelled, Here comes Andy! And a man she didn't recognize, dressed as Buzz, fell to the ground and held still. Being busy made her look normal, even if she was a shriveled brown leaf inside. Life without Judd was a life without color, even fall colors. All she saw was dead grass, bare trees, and a gray sky. Halfway through the parade, she wondered where the kids were. She should have seen them by now. They should be in the middle of the pack, where she told them to stay when she left. Deputies patrolled the parade route, some on foot and a couple on motorcycles who circled up and back. 3/4 of the way through, she started to panic. Walking up the route, she kept her eyes glued on the smaller participants. Where were they? Miles knew to stay with Laney. She drilled that into him last year, threatening to ground him from trick-or-treating if he so much as dropped her hand to scratch his nose. Her one consolation was that they were both missing. Maybe Laney had to go to the bathroom and they were stuck at the PPTPs just off Main Street. There was a break in the crowd, and she moved back to the front of the line to see the kids pass. Ice Princess, Captain America, Frankenstein, football zombie with matching cheerleader, but no pumpkin. Her heart thumped a heavy beat. She grabbed the man standing nearest. "Did you see my kids?" The man shook his head. "I don't think so." She mumbled thanks and ducked back to the sidewalk to continue her quest. The end of the parade was suddenly upon her, and the watchers joined the back of the line, clogging Main Street. She was about to scream Miles's name when a flash of orange caught her eye. She bolted in that direction, dodging people and mumbling apologies. She came up short at the sight of Laney crying in Judd's arms. Her whole being cried out to rush to him. Wynn started crying and couldn't stop, so she gave up on self-control and ran to the man offering comfort to her daughter. Miles stood to the side, holding on to the bottom of Judd's jacket. He hung his head. "We missed the parade," he told Wynn. She scooped him up and hugged him tight, all the while drinking in the sight of Judd. He hadn't shaved. Was that the same shirt he'd had on 2 days ago? He watched her while offering soft, soothing words to Laney. "What happened?" Wynn asked Miles. She glanced down and saw his costume was torn. "Someone called Laney a baby pumpkin. I shoved him and told him to shut up. We started fighting, and the one lady told us we couldn't be in the parade if we were going to fight." Wynn's jaw hardened. Who was this kid? She had a few things to say to his parents. Judd put his hand on her arm. "He's from out of town. His parents hauled him off to the car. They're already headed home." "You saw this?" She was still upset on her children's behalf and ready to let him have it for not stopping the fight, for being here and making her feel all these feelings for him, and for being so sweet with Laney that it was breaking her heart all over again. He shook his head. "I got here right as they were ushered out of the line." She hugged Miles. "Thank you for sticking up for your sister." There would be other moments to talk about conflict resolution. Right now, she was so relieved he was safe. He hugged her back, feeling every bit the little boy with gangly arms she wanted to keep in her mama's heart forever. He wiggled down. "Can we still go to the big barn?" Wynn glanced at Judd. Laney was entrenched in his arms and showed no sign of letting him go. "Yeah, we can." Wynn held out her arms. "Laney, can I carry you?" "I want Uncle Judd." She tucked her head under his chin and stuck out her bottom lip. If there was a more beautiful sight, she couldn't name it. Why did this have to be so hard? "I'm happy to walk with you guys." Judd started off. Miles caught up quickly and grabbed onto the bottom of his jacket. The three of them together was a sight so familiar, she ached. Walking several steps behind them, she soaked up the feeling of rightness, knowing she'd have to rip off the Band-Aid all over again and not caring. Judd bought tickets for the kids, and they were soon off to the carnival games, bobbing for apples and fishing for prizes, which left Wynn alone with Judd in a room full of people. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye and then looked away again. Judd kept his eyes forward as he asked, "Can I ask you a question?" "I wish you wouldn't." She hugged herself. "I know I look like I have it all together, but I'm not doing great, so the less we talk about things, the better." He rolled his eyes and turned to stare at her. "Actually, you look old and tired." Her mouth fell open. "Excuse me?" She smacked his arm, hard. "You don't look any better. Try changing your shirt, buddy." She went to smack him again, and he grabbed her hand, threading their fingers together. His tenderness sucked the fight right out of her.
You haven't washed your hair.
Her lip quivered. You need a shave.
I bet you do too.
He tapped her hip with his free hand. She scowled. Leave my legs out of this. He gave her a bad boy grin.
I can't. They're a part of you. And since this conversation is about you and me, we have to talk about your legs.
There is no you and me. The words were so quiet, she didn't know if they came out of her mouth or she just thought them.
There will always be a you and me.
He tugged on her hand and she stepped closer, drawn in by a force she was powerless to fight against. I can't. She shifted from foot to foot.
I'm not asking you to marry me.
He continued to smile in that maddening, completely wonderful way.
All I'm asking is for you to let me love you and to go for hot cocoa together, just you and me.
Wynn shook her head. You don't know what you're giving up. What about getting married and having a family and being a dad? You should have those experiences. He turned her chin so she could see her kids as they reeled in their prizes.
I have everything I've ever wanted. With you. Just the way we are. I can live like this, in heaven, for a long time, Wynn. You don't have to push me away, and you don't have to wear my ring to make me happy.
She swiped at her nose. But he silenced her with a kiss. She should have fought him off, should have pushed away and refused to talk to him ever again. But she didn't have the heart to do it. In fact, her heart was the very thing keeping her right there in his arms. Because the moment his lips touched hers, a gush of love washed over her and healed the dried up and broken pieces inside of her. I shouldn't want this so much, she said against his mouth as she wrapped her arms around his neck. He pulled back slightly.
Because of Thatcher?
She smiled softly. No. He told me many times to find a good man, to move on.
He did?
Judd rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. He told me
to make sure that you were happy. That's all I want, Wynn. To make you happy.
His eyes opened and she was lost in the love that poured out of them. Love for her. Is this even possible? She leaned into him, hoping, praying.
It already is. I love you, Wynn. Like my own flesh and blood. I won't talk about getting married until you're ready, but you should know I'm in this for our whole lives, no matter what form it takes.
She laughed through her tears. Do you have any idea what you're in for? He hugged her to his chest.
I know exactly what I'm in for. And I can't wait.
Lainey ran into them and threw her arms around her legs. I'm starving. She looked up, taking them both in. Miles tugged on Judd's arm. Look at the frog I won. He really jumps.
That's cool.
Judd released her, slid his hand down her arm, and took her hand.
Who wants pumpkin cocoa?
Me. Lainey danced around in a circle. Wynn watched it all in amazement. She'd seen Judd with the kids countless times, but it was only in this moment that she saw things clearly. You really love us, don't you? Just the way we are. Judd leaned over Miles and kissed her temple.
I really do.
She laid her head on his shoulder. Then I guess you're stuck with us. He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands.
Kids, I'm going to kiss your mother.
Lainey giggled behind her hands. Miles made gagging noises. Wynn laughed. The joy inside of her was so big, she could barely bring her lips together to kiss Judd back. He was persistent, though, and after a moment she was caught up in his embrace. Someone whistled. They broke apart, laughing.
Now the whole town knows.
Judd took her hand again and walked toward the exit. Miles followed close, and Lainey reached for her free hand. Wynn hip-bumped Judd. Yeah, so the ladies better back off. He growled low and nuzzled her neck.
I like it when you're feisty.
Shivers ran across her skin. You ain't seen nothin' yet, she countered. He laughed and started running, the whole family racing to keep up with him. Wynn understood the need to run. There was so much happiness inside of her, she couldn't hold still. Life was so good. She wanted to freeze this moment and hold on to it forever. It couldn't get any better than this. Chapter 18. Wynn. Wynn rubbed her lips together. "Do you have your card?" she asked Miles.
"Yes,"
he shot back. She didn't get after him for his tone, since this was the 12th time she'd asked the same question. "Sorry, I'm nervous." Lainey spun in circles, making her dress flow out around her.
"Surprise, surprise, surprise, surprise,"
she chanted.
"Shh,"
Miles scowled.
"You're going to ruin it."
Wynn grabbed Lainey mid-spin and covered her face with kisses. "You won't ruin this, I promise. Come on, we don't want Thanksgiving dinner to get cold." Wynn checked her chocolate brown dress in the mirror one more time. She'd ordered the retro pencil beauty a week ago and prayed that 2-day shipping actually came through for her. It had, and she felt amazing. She'd let her hair down and applied extra thick liner for a sultry look she only attempted on special occasions. It was Thanksgiving, after all, and she had so much to be thankful for. Especially Judd. He'd been true to his word and not mentioned marriage since Halloween. His silence on the topic gave her time to think things through, and she realized something. Judd was a giver. Thatcher had not been. His family catered to him and made him the center of their worlds. As they should. She couldn't fault them for cherishing the short time they had together. If it had been her child with the disease, she would have done the same thing. Thankfully, it wasn't genetic, and her children were in the clear. That didn't mean she hadn't learned how to be in the moment with them. That was a gift she'd gotten from Thatcher, and she'd always be grateful he'd taught her to love like that, because her own parents had failed in that regard. Because they'd all focused on Thatcher, it made each of them unselfish by nature. Judd didn't ask permission to practically move in here and take care of her and the kids. He just did what needed to be done and served them. There was no way to count the times he'd saved her in some way, and he'd never asked for anything in return. Until he'd asked for her love. And, like a big old selfish jerk, she'd been more concerned about herself than him. When she started to think about him, and what it would be like to be married to a man with a heart as big as the pumpkins he grew, her worries melted away. She wouldn't lose herself in Judd, because he was strong on his own and loved her just as she was, with some room to grow in whatever direction she stretched. Noting the color on her cheeks, already flushed from excitement, she ushered the kids along. Judd came out of his house at the same time they did, his tie flapping in the breeze. The air had a nip in it that meant snow was on the way. They might even see flurries before the pie was served. The kids ran down the street toward the B&B while she waited for Judd to catch up. "You look incredible." He stopped tying his tie and kissed her slow. She loved it when he took his time. It melted her insides and created sinewy heat. Who cared if it snowed? She had a furnace right here. She was on the edge of forgetting her name when she pulled back. "Come on, they won't hold dinner for us." Karen probably would make the family wait until they were all there, but Wynn didn't want to make her. These last few weeks had been bliss, the best she'd ever had. Judd's family had accepted their new relationship with grace. Even Bertie had gotten used to the idea of them kissing fairly quickly. She managed to cover the kids' eyes now and again, and knocked before coming in the house. They got a few looks at church the first Sunday they walked in holding hands, but most people said, "It's about time," and moved on to other topics of conversation. Wyatt's eyebrows had shot up, but he gave Judd a solid nod of approval. The general acceptance left her wondering what had taken her so long to figure out she and Judd were meant to be together. They joined the family in the formal dining room. Scott stood at the head of the table. He needed space and leverage to carve the giant bird in front of him. The table was piled high with stuffing, salads, deviled eggs, homemade rolls, and so much more. Brody's spot was empty, and Wynn was a little disappointed he hadn't come today. She'd stopped in to talk to him about her plans. He wished her well, but said that the day would be brighter if he didn't cast a shadow over dinner. One day, the prodigal son would come home. It might take a miracle, but she believed miracles happened, so there was always hope. "Who wants to start the thanks?" asked Scott. Family tradition dictated they each list something they were thankful for while Dad carved the turkey. They had to keep listing until he finished.
I will.
Lainey bounced in her seat. Wynn wanted to squeeze her eyes shut and smile so hard her face hurt. This was the big moment. "Go right ahead, sweetheart," Karen encouraged. Lainey stood up, which wasn't necessary, and cleared her throat.
I'm thankful for Judd because he tells the best stories and he makes my mommy happy.
A chorus of awes echoed her pronouncement. Miles stood up too.
I'm thankful that my mom wants to marry Judd.
The room went silent. Wynn's heart beat so loud she couldn't clear her thoughts. It was her turn, and her tongue was tied in a knot. She stood up and took Judd's hand. I'm thankful for Judd's patience as I freaked out about everything and came to my senses. I love him with all my heart. Judd quirked a grin at her. He leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who had snagged the biggest fish in the lake. Wynn wanted to smack his arm and tell him to knock it off and kiss the smugness right off his mouth, but her heart beat so fast she could barely breathe. Judd Westbrook, now would be the perfect time to ask me to marry you. He glanced around the room. Well, Anders smacked him on the back. Get moving! Laughter filled the room. Judd stood, filling Wynn's view and heart. He hooked his thumb under her chin. If I'm smug, it's only because I picked out the perfect ring. Yesterday. He dug in his pocket and produced an engagement ring with a princess-cut diamond. Wynn gasped. How did you know? She leaned closer and whispered, Was it Lainey? Did she spill the beans? He lifted her hand and poised the ring just in front of her finger. Lainey knows how to keep a secret. He winked at the little girl, and she giggled. She went with me to pick this out. Lainey threw her arms in the air.
I told you there was a surprise. Surprise, surprise.
Wynn laughed at her antics. Judd turned her back to face him. Wynn, you are the woman of my dreams. Tears gathered, and she tried to blink them away. Will you be my wife? She nodded before bursting out a yes. Judd kissed her quickly and then hugged her close. She held on to him, filled with the freedom to love him, to show that love, and to allow his love to fill her. He'd always done that, filled her up. Once she recognized that, she was ready to give her life and pledge her heart to him. Lainey climbed on her chair and jumped into their hug. Miles was right behind her, and soon they were hugging and laughing. In the beginning, they'd come together out of necessity, but it was in this moment that they chose to become a family. Epilogue. Alice Westbrook. If birthday candles had any magic in them, which Alice Westbrook highly suspected they did, then wishing for something more than friendship with Russ was crazy scary because it would change simply everything about her existence. Therefore, despite the fact that she'd only decided to change their friend status to friendlier a few hours ago, she'd planned this moment down to the last detail. In her fantasy, Russ would catch sight of her out of the corner of his eye as he made his way down the Titanic-ish curving staircase, her long honey-colored hair draping over her thin shoulders, and her lashes lowered as she read a Bronte or Dickens novel. He'd be so struck by her beauty that he'd just stare as a desire to be near her built within his impressive chest. Finally, when the distance was too much for him, their magnetic attraction would pull him across the room to gently touch her elbow. Bringing her gaze up to his brooding brown eyes would reveal the astonishment and joy of new love. Only a heartbeat would pass before he lowered his lips to brush against hers in a petal-soft caress. Alice sighed to herself. Ah, Russ. Her phone beeped a reminder, and she jolted from her daydream of strategizing. She should already be in her seat if she had any hope of bringing her imaginings to fruition. Dropping her lipstick into her purse, she scrubbed her moist palms down the front of her black skinny jeans. She flipped her head over and shook out her hair, giving it bounce and volume that women in shampoo commercials would envy. Blowing out a breath that had stuck in her throat, she was ready to step across the proverbial threshold and into adventure, and quite possibly romance. Her knees trembled with a mixture of anticipation and fear. "You can do this," she affirmed under her breath. "Take a chance." This has been From Best Friend to Husband, a Pumpkins and Proposals novel, the Harvest Ranch romance series, written by Lucy McConnell, narrated by Liz Crane. Copyright 2020 by Christina Dimmick. Production copyright by Christina Dimmick.